It had been a long, tiring week, and I was looking forward to a weekend getaway in the cabin my friend had rented. Situated on a quiet, wooded plot miles away from the nearest town, the place was isolated enough to offer the peace and quiet I needed to unwind. No distractions, no hustle, just the quiet hum of nature. I'd driven up earlier that day, following the winding back roads through thick trees, each curve of the road feeling like it took me further away from everything. I had almost forgotten how beautiful and peaceful it could be out here, in the wilderness. I'd barely seen another car all day. There was something serene about the emptiness, like time itself had slowed down. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled among the trees. It was old, built years ago, but had been well maintained. A small porch wrapped around the front, and there was a stone fire pit out back. The windows were tall, offering a clear view of the woods beyond. I set my bags down, took a deep breath, and smiled. It was perfect. The inside of the cabin was as charming as the outside. Wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the entryway. The air smelled like cedar and fresh pine, the scent of the forest creeping in from the open windows. A fireplace sat in the living room, its chimney jutting up through the roof. Old hunting trophies adorned the walls, their glass eyes staring back at me. I wasn't big on hunting, but I could appreciate the effort that had gone into decorating. After unloading my things, I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackle of the logs filling the silence of the cabin. The sound was comforting until it wasn't. The wind had picked up by then, howling outside and causing the trees to sway. I watched the branches dance in the wind, their shadows cast against the walls like dark, waving fingers. It was eerie, but in a soothing way. The kind of eerie that makes you feel alive, yet at peace with it. But as the evening wore on, the wind grew stronger, and with it came the first unsettling sensation I hadn't expected. I was alone. The silence in the cabin became thicker, almost suffocating. It wasn't that the place was cold or unwelcoming. It was just empty. I had spent plenty of time alone before, but this felt different, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to the isolation and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I moved, I thought I heard something shift just beyond the walls. A creak, a rustle, or the softest scratch against the windows. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks, but it didn't help the tension coiling in my gut. The evening passed slowly. I ate a simple dinner and tried to relax by the fire. I found a book on the coffee table, one that looked as though it had been left behind by a previous guest, and tried to lose myself in its pages. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept wandering back to that odd, heavy feeling in the air. There was something about the cabin that felt off, something small and barely noticeable, but still unsettling. It wasn't until I decided to go to bed that I realized just how quiet the night had become. The wind had died down completely, leaving behind a dead silence that seemed to echo in the stillness. The only sounds now were the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the soft hum of my own breathing. I lay down in the bedroom, the bed creaking beneath me as I shifted into position. The room was small, but comfortable, with a large window facing the woods outside. As I stared out into the darkness, I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. It was a quiet sensation, but it settled over me like a heavy blanket. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, every rustle of the trees outside feeling too loud, every creak from the floorboards beneath the cabin too obvious. My mind kept replaying the sounds I thought I'd heard earlier, but there was no clear explanation for them. It was a feeling more than anything, like something was hiding in the dark, just out of sight, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. The cabin was eerily silent. I lay still, my breath shallow, trying to pinpoint what had caused me to wake up. And then I heard it. A faint tapping sound, soft but distinct, coming from somewhere in the house. It was like someone was lightly knocking on a window or the wall, but the sound was coming from inside. I froze, not sure whether to move or not. I listened, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the living room, I didn't dare get up, but my curiosity gnawed at me. My phone was on the bedside table, so I reached for it, trying to make as little noise as possible. The screen lit up, revealing a message from a friend, but I couldn't focus on it. The tapping kept getting louder. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was inside the cabin with me. My breath quickened, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. My heart thudded in my chest as I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a soft shuffle, like someone was moving around in the living room. I hadn't heard the door open, and the windows were all locked. The thoughts running through my mind were a blur of panic and confusion. Who could it be? Why hadn't I heard them come in? Was it someone from the nearby town? A hunter, maybe? But the tapping wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deliberate, too strange. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and crept into the living room. The beam of light cut through the dark, casting long shadows across the floor. There was no one there, nothing out of place, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, almost suffocating. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, deep down, that something was wrong. I turned back toward the hallway, but then I froze. On the wall opposite the fireplace, there was a fresh handprint, smudged into the dust on the wood. It was small, like a child's hand, but it was recent. Too recent. I backed away from it, my heart racing. There was no way anyone had been in here without me noticing. I checked every window. I'd locked the door. The handprint couldn't have appeared on its own. The next few hours were a blur of frantic thinking. I searched every inch of the cabin, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No indication that anyone had been here. I even checked the back door, which was locked and bolted, just as I had left it. The house was still secure, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. The unease, the strange sounds, the handprint, everything added up to something I couldn't ignore. I packed my things quickly, keeping my eyes on every corner of the cabin, as if I expected someone to appear from the shadows at any moment. When I stepped outside into the morning light, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I got into my car and left without a second thought. The drive home felt long, but at least it was quiet. There was no more strange tapping or feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that cabin. Some places, no matter how beautiful, were just better left alone. The handprint, the silence, the strange tapping, it didn't make sense. But sometimes not everything needs an explanation, and sometimes it's better that way. It was the kind of weekend I was looking forward to. The cabin was secluded, tucked away in a forest that stretched far beyond the eyes could see. It was an old cabin, one that hadn't seen a lot of upkeep, but I liked that. It gave it character, a history of sorts. The kind of place where you could truly disconnect from everything. No neighbors, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and the silence. I packed up my things early that morning, making sure to bring enough food and supplies for the next few days. There was something refreshing about being alone. Not a lot of people understood that. They thought I was weird, but that didn't bother me. I enjoyed the solitude. My car rattled as I made my way down the long gravel road that led to the cabin. The trees lining the road, their branches heavy with early spring leaves. The drive was a quiet one, the only noise being the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the tires on the gravel. It was a 4-hour drive, but the anticipation of reaching the cabin made it seem shorter. I could already picture the crackling of the fire in the fireplace, the smell of pine wood filling the air, and the comfort of a warm, familiar bed. When I finally turned off the gravel road onto the narrow, even rougher path that led to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. The place was remote, and that's exactly what I needed. I had been under a lot of pressure lately, work, social obligations, the usual, but here I could leave all that behind. It was just me and the forest. I pulled up in front of the cabin. It looked exactly as I remembered. The wood was weathered and faded, the roof sagging just a little bit. There were a couple of cracked windows, but it wasn't anything that would stop me from enjoying my time. I grabbed my bag and took the key from the little hiding spot under the front porch, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The interior was dark, but the smell of the old wooden beams and the musty air greeted me like an old friend. I opened the curtains and let in the afternoon sun. The place was small, cozy, with a single room that had a couch, a small kitchen, and a stone fireplace. There was a ladder that led up to a small loft, just enough room for a bed and some shelves. I set my bag down and took a deep breath, letting the silence of the place settle in. The only sound was the occasional bird call from outside and the rustling of the leaves in the trees. I knew it would take a little while to adjust to the quiet, but I welcomed it. I got a fire started right away, the crackle of the wood filling the space with warmth and the comforting smell of burning pine. The rest of the day was uneventful. I unpacked my things, made some tea, and sat by the fire. The first evening in the cabin was peaceful, and I couldn't have asked for anything more. I had no plans, no distractions, just time to think and relax. As the night wore on, the shadows grew longer, stretching across the floor like dark fingers. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. I finished my tea and went up to the loft to bed, pulling the old quilt from the top of the mattress. It was the kind of quilt that had been passed down for generations, thick and heavy, with the smell of old cotton that somehow still felt comforting. The bed creaked as I settled in, the sound of the fire crackling downstairs barely audible. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear the branches of the trees swaying in the breeze. The night was still, but there was a sense of movement in the air, something not entirely natural. I rolled over, trying to ignore the slight unease that crept into my chest. It was probably just the isolation. I wasn't used to being alone in such a remote place. It wasn't the first time I'd been to the cabin, but it had been a while. I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. I've always been the kind of person who prefers peace over excitement. So when I heard about a cabin in the woods that could be rented for a weekend getaway, it seemed perfect. It was isolated, quiet, and far away from the noise of the city. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small cabin near a lake, surrounded by thick trees. No one would be around, and I'd have nothing to do but relax. I'd been working a lot lately, and the thought of getting away from everything for a few days sounded like the best idea. So, I packed my things, grabbed a few snacks, and headed out alone. I wasn't afraid of being alone in the woods. It seemed like the kind of peace I needed. The drive out took a little longer than I expected, mostly because the road was narrow and winding, and I had to keep my eyes on the map to make sure I didn't miss a turn. There was no cell service once I got far enough out, which I knew was part of the charm. The cabin was supposed to be out in the middle of nowhere, and I was fine with that. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. I was a little nervous, but not in a way that felt threatening, more like I was about to have a new experience. The cabin itself looked exactly how I imagined. Old, wooden, and slightly worn down. It didn't have any real luxuries, but it was cozy, with a small front porch and big windows that looked out at the trees. I unloaded my things and went inside. The air smelled of pine and wood. The floors creaked under my feet as I walked around, checking out the kitchen, the living area, and the bedroom. The place wasn't as modern as I was used to, but I liked it. It felt authentic, as if it had been there for years, untouched by the hustle and bustle of the world. I started a fire in the fireplace. It wasn't too cold yet, but there was something comforting about the flames. I spent the evening reading and sipping some tea, enjoying the solitude. There were no streetlights, no sounds from other people, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. Later, as the night deepened, I noticed how dark it was outside. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, and the trees blocked out any light from the stars. It was absolute darkness beyond the cabin's windows. At first, it felt peaceful, but as the hours passed, I began to feel a strange sense of unease. I wasn't scared, just uneasy, like something was off. It wasn't like there were sounds or anything out of the ordinary. The wind whistling through the trees, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl, normal sounds. But there was this weight in the air, something that made me feel like I wasn't truly alone. It didn't make sense. I was in a remote place. The only thing around was nature, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I climbed into the old, creaky bed, tucked myself in, and tried to sleep. It took longer than usual. The cabin wasn't quiet in the way I expected. Every little sound, creaks, groans, rustling outside, seemed louder in the stillness of the night. I kept imagining something moving around the house, but when I checked, everything was as it should be. There was nothing there. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't the restful sleep I hoped for. I kept waking up, heart racing for no reason. It was like my mind kept checking for something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't see. At one point, I even thought I heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. Soft, almost like they were trying not to make a noise. But when I went to the window to look, there was no one there. Nothing but the trees swaying in the wind. The next morning, I brushed it off. It had probably just been a raccoon or a deer, or my imagination getting the best of me. The sky was overcast, and there was a light drizzle, so I decided to take a walk around the property. I wanted to explore a bit, maybe clear my head. There was a small trail that led deeper into the woods behind the cabin. I figured I'd follow it for a while just to get a feel for the land. As I walked, the trail grew steeper, and the trees became denser. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of rain from the leaves above. It felt good to get away from the cabin, to feel the damp earth beneath my feet. But as I went further, I started to notice something strange. There were small markers along the trail, stones stacked in odd patterns, like someone had placed them there intentionally. I thought it was odd but dismissed it. Maybe they were just there from when the trail was first made, or perhaps someone else had walked through recently. But as I kept walking, I noticed more of them, placed in specific spots, as if someone had been following this path intentionally, marking it in some way. Then I saw something even stranger. A small, crude symbol carved into one of the trees. It was barely visible, worn down from years of exposure, but it was definitely there. A circle with lines through it, a shape I couldn't quite recognize. It gave me an odd chill. I tried to shake it off, but something about it didn't sit right. I kept walking for a little while longer, but the more I looked around, the more I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but there was this heavy, uncomfortable sensation in the air. I turned back, deciding that I'd had enough of the trail for today. When I returned to the cabin, I took a deep breath and pushed the weird feeling out of my mind. I'd been alone for a while now, and it was easy to let my imagination get the best of me. I spent the rest of the day inside, reading, writing in my journal, and trying to relax. That night, the unease returned. This time, it was stronger. I tried to sleep again, but the darkness outside seemed more oppressive. I kept thinking I saw things moving at the edges of my vision, but when I looked, nothing was there. The fire crackled, sending small pops into the air. Then I heard it. A thud came from the front porch just outside the door. My heart skipped. I froze, listening. It was too quiet now. Another thud, louder this time, followed by a scrape against the wood. I slowly got up, my hands trembling as I reached for the flashlight by the door. I stepped cautiously toward the window and peeked through the blinds. First, I saw nothing, but then movement. It was fast, darting just out of view. I froze again. Was it an animal? Person? It was hard to tell, but whatever it wasn't normal. I couldn't take my eyes off the window, waiting for any sign of movement. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I mustered the courage to open the door. I stepped onto the porch, shining the flashlight across the ground, trying to find any sign of what was out there. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anything. The area was undisturbed. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but the feeling didn't go away. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and drove off in the dark, not even looking back. The whole drive back, I kept thinking about the strange symbols, the sounds, the feeling of being watched. Maybe it was all in my head, but something didn't sit right about that place. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calming. The cabin was meant to be a retreat, but instead, it left me feeling unsettled. I don't think I'll ever return, but at least I made it out. The trip wasn't a complete disaster. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in that quiet, dark cabin in the woods, and for now, that's enough. The sun was setting as I made my way up the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. The drive had been longer than I expected, and the fading light added an extra layer of tension to my thoughts. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping to get away from the noise of city life and spend some time alone in the woods, away from everything. I had no particular reason for choosing this spot. It was just a random listing I found online. It looked cozy enough, small, rustic, and secluded. The trees seemed to close in around me as I approached the cabin, their shadows stretching long across the ground. There was no one else around for miles. I turned off the engine, the car's hum silencing as I got out. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd expect to find in an old camping brochure. Weathered wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a front porch with a couple of creaky rocking chairs. I grabbed my bags and made my way inside, the door creaking loudly as I opened it. The interior was simple but comfortable. A small living room with a stone fireplace dominated the center of the space, and the kitchen was just off to the side, complete with old-fashioned appliances that still worked just fine. There was a small wooden table in the corner, and a set of stairs that led to the bedroom upstairs. The first thing I did was start a fire in the fireplace. The weather was getting cooler, and I wanted to feel cozy. As the flames crackled and danced, I unpacked my things, setting up in the bedroom. The bed was large enough to be comfortable, with a thick quilt that had seen better days. The room had a small window that looked out over the woods, and I took a moment to admire the view before I settled in for the night. I spent the evening reading and relaxing, the kind of quiet I hadn't experienced in a long time. The only sounds were the occasional crack of wood in the fireplace and the rustling of leaves outside. There was no phone service and no internet connection, which at first felt a little isolating, but soon it became a relief. It was nice to disconnect from everything. As night fell, I noticed something strange. The house was completely silent, except for the sounds of nature outside. But there was something odd about the silence, something off. It wasn't the usual quiet you'd expect in a remote cabin. It was as though the night was too still, almost unnervingly so. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just imagining things. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch knocking against the window. But then it came again, a little louder this time. I got up and walked over to the window, peering out into the dark. The trees were still. No wind, no movement, just the same dark shapes that had been there earlier. I frowned and turned away, deciding I was just being paranoid. I made my way back to the living room, sat back down in front of the fire, and tried to relax. But the tapping continued, faint but persistent. It was coming from the door. I stood up again, heart racing a little faster than I'd like to admit. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin was far off the main road, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I walked cautiously to the door, looking out through the small glass window. Nothing. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see if anyone was out there. There was no one. No person, no animal, nothing. Just the dark woods stretching out in front of me. But the tapping, it was still there. Now it sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin. I stepped out into the cold night air, my breath coming out in clouds as I walked around the house. The tapping grew louder as I approached the corner. I had no idea what could be making it. It didn't sound like an animal. It was more rhythmic, almost like a person tapping their fingers on the wall. When I rounded the corner, I froze. There, on the side of the cabin, was a large tree branch, bouncing against the wood with each gust of wind. But there was no wind. The branch wasn't moving on its own. It was being pushed, somehow. I didn't know what to make of it, but I felt uneasy. The entire situation seemed wrong. I hurried back inside, locked the door behind me, and sat down by the fire. I tried to calm myself, but the unease kept gnawing at the back of my mind. I didn't want to stay in that cabin anymore, but I had no choice. The road back was long, and I just arrived. Figured I'd give it one more night. If things felt off again tomorrow, I'd pack up and leave. The tapping stopped after a while, but the silence that followed felt even worse. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I stayed as still as I could, eyes wide open in the dark. The next morning, the air was still and cool, the sun shining weakly through the trees. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed a jacket and stepped outside, taking in the fresh air. The woods looked peaceful enough during the day, the shadows not nearly as menacing as they had seemed the night before. But as I walked along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. It was just my mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the sensation of being followed. Every time I turned around, the woods seemed even quieter. The sounds of birds and animals had gone, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. I kept walking, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping in. After about an hour, I decided to head back to the cabin. As I neared the clearing where the cabin stood, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing just outside the cabin, facing the door. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't. It was a pile of clothes draped over something that was standing unnaturally still. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the figure, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. I could hear my breath coming fast as I turned around and started walking quickly back down the trail. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, faster and faster, my mind racing. I didn't know what that thing was, but I didn't want to find out. I didn't go back to the cabin. I walked straight to my car and drove back to the main road. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small motel. I checked in and didn't look back. The whole experience left me shaken. But the one thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't going back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I did some research about the area. There wasn't much online, but I did find a few local stories about strange happenings in the woods. Nothing specific, just vague mentions of strange occurrences. People who'd heard things, seen shadows, or had inexplicable experiences. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I did start to wonder if maybe I wasn't just imagining things. Maybe there was something to the feeling of being watched. I never did find out what was out there in those woods, but I do know one thing for certain. Some places are better left unexplored. The feeling of dread that settled over me the moment I stepped foot in that cabin was something I couldn't shake, and I have no desire to ever go back. The cabin was old, tucked deep in the woods where the trees grew too close together, their branches scraping against the roof like bony fingers. I had rented it online. Cheap, secluded, perfect for some quiet time away from the city. The pictures showed a cozy little place with a stone fireplace and a view of the lake. They didn't show the way the floorboards creaked like something was moving under them, or how the wind sounded like whispers through the cracks in the walls. I arrived just before sunset. The key was under a moss-covered rock, right where the owner said it would be. The air smelled damp, like rain and rotting leaves. Inside, the cabin was colder than I expected. The fireplace was full of old ashes, and the furniture smelled like mildew. I dropped my bag on the couch, dust puffing up from the cushions. The first night was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the occasional groan of the old wood settling. I slept fitfully, waking up every hour to the sound of something skittering across the roof. Probably a squirrel, I told myself. Just a squirrel. Morning came, gray and misty. I made coffee on the stove, the gas hissing like a slow breath. The water from the tap was brown at first, then cleared after a few seconds. I drank it anyway. Outside, the trees swayed in a wind I couldn't feel. The lake was still, its surface like black glass. I spent the day chopping firewood, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The axe was heavy in my hands, each swing sending splinters flying. By the time I stacked the wood by the door, my palms were raw. Night fell again. This time, the noises were worse. Something scratched at the door, not like an animal, slower, deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The scratching stopped. Then, after a long silence, it started again, this time on the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound dragged along the glass, like nails being dragged down it. I grabbed the axe from beside the bed and crept to the window. The curtains were thin, moth-eaten. I pulled them back slowly. Nothing, just darkness and the reflection of my own face, pale and wide-eyed. I told myself it was the wind, branches, my imagination, but the air was dead still. No wind, no branches close enough to reach the window. I didn't sleep. Morning came again, weaker this time, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. I packed my things. This wasn't worth it. I get my money back, leave a bad review, never come back. But when I tried to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. Just a clicking sound, like something was stuck. I popped the hood. The battery cables were chewed through, the wires frayed and glistening with fresh bite marks. No, not bite marks, cut marks. Someone had done this. I ran back inside, locked the door. My hands shook as I dialed 911. No signal. Of course, the owner had warned me about that. Perfect for disconnecting, he'd said. I wasn't alone here. I grabbed the axe, pressed my back against the wall near the door. If someone came in, I'd be ready. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, just as the sun dipped below the trees, I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. They stopped right outside the door. The knob turned. The lock held. A beat of silence. Then, a thud. Shoulder against wood. The door shuddered. Again. I raised the axe. The door burst open. A man stood there, tall, his face shadowed by a hood. In his hand, a hunting knife. He lunged. I swung. The axe hit his shoulder with a wet crunch. He screamed, staggered back. I swung again, missed. He slashed at me, the knife grazing my arm. Hot pain flared. I kicked him in the stomach. He stumbled, tripped over the threshold. I brought the axe down. This time I didn't miss. Silence. Blood pooled on the floorboards. I stood there, breathing hard, the axe still in my hands. Then I ran. Through the woods, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I saw headlights. A truck on the main road. I waved my arms, screaming. The driver stopped. I told him everything. Police found the cabin. The man wasn't dead, just bleeding badly. Turns out he'd done this before. Broken into cabins, killed people who stayed in them. The owner had no idea. I got my money back, but I still dream about the scratching and the way the door sounded when it broke open. The cabin sat on a small hill, secluded from the nearby town. The roads to get here weren't exactly paved, and the GPS seemed to struggle with the location. I had to rely on old, handwritten directions I got from the rental agency. They told me it would be peaceful, quiet, perfect for a weekend to escape from everything. But as soon as I pulled up, there was an eerie stillness that I couldn't quite shake. The place was remote, tucked in a forest with trees stretching far and wide in every direction. It wasn't a typical vacation spot. No tourist attractions, no busy downtown with shops and restaurants. It was just nature. A few cabins, scattered around like forgotten relics of a bygone era. The cabin itself was modest, nothing fancy. Wooden with a rusted tin roof, peeling paint on the door, and the windows covered in grime. The smell of pine trees mixed with damp earth filled the air. I unloaded my bags, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. I had rented this cabin for a weekend of peace, away from work, away from the noise. But something about the place unsettled me. It wasn't that it was run down. It wasn't even the isolation. It was just a feeling. Inside, it was basic. An old couch covered in a floral print, a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and an outdated kitchen. The place wasn't falling apart, but it had clearly been neglected for some time. I set my bags down and took a long, deep breath. The first night passed without incident. I spent some time sitting by the fire, reading, and getting the place set up. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside was calming, and the crackling of the fire was soothing. I cooked a simple meal and ate alone, with only the occasional creak of the cabin to keep me company. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The air outside had gotten colder, and I could hear the howl of a distant animal in the woods, maybe a coyote or something similar. I tried not to think too much about it, but the thought of animals roaming just outside the cabin doors kept me alert. The bed was small but comfortable. The sheets smelled faintly of must, but I was too tired to care. I wrapped myself in the blankets, and my body quickly gave way to sleep. Part 2, the sounds. It didn't take long for me to realize that something was wrong. The first noise came around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the occasional groan and creak that old buildings make. But this was different. It was a scratching sound, faint but persistent, coming from outside the window. I tried to ignore it, rolling over in bed, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, and more distinct. It sounded like something was clawing at the window, dragging across the wood. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. I was alone, but the sound was clear, like nails against glass. I pulled the blanket tight around me, my mind racing with possibilities. A raccoon? Maybe a tree branch scraping the glass? But something about it felt wrong, too deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and slowly crept out of bed, careful not to make any noise. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, casting long shadows across the room. I made my way to the window, hesitating just for a moment before I pulled back the curtain. There was nothing, just the dark, empty yard and the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. No animals, no branches, nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I returned to bed, trying to shake off the unease. I convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. It wasn't the first time I had been alone in a remote place, and it wouldn't be the last. I shut my eyes and forced myself to drift back to sleep. Part 3, the discovery. The next morning, I woke up early. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on everything. I felt better, like the fresh morning air had wiped away the worries of the night before. I took a deep breath, smelling the pine trees once more, and felt a sense of relief wash over me. But as I walked outside to get some fresh air, I noticed something strange. There were scratch marks on the cabin's wooden walls. Long, deep grooves that weren't there the day before. They started low to the ground at the base of the cabin and stretched up to just below the windows. The marks weren't random either. They were methodical, like something had been dragged along the wall with purpose. I ran my fingers over them, shivering despite the warm sun. The wood felt smooth under my touch, the grooves deep but not freshly made. They had been there for a while. I walked around the back of the cabin, looking for anything that might explain it. And that's when I saw it. A piece of wood, half rotted and leaning against the side of the cabin. It was splintered, broken in several places, like something had been using it to scratch at the walls. But what? I didn't know what to make of it. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a bear or something bigger, but the scratches looked too deliberate, too precise. I spent the rest of the morning trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. But the unease continued to gnaw at me, growing stronger with each passing hour. Part 4. The night comes again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Every gust of wind felt like it carried some hidden meaning. Every noise outside felt too close. And then, around midnight, I heard it again. The scratching, It was soft at first, like a distant whisper against the walls. But then it grew louder, dragging across the wood with a slow, methodical pace. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight, moving toward the window with my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain. There, in the moonlight, I saw it. A large, dark figure, crouching low to the ground just outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I had ever seen. Its body was hunched, with long, twisted limbs that seemed too long for its frame. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes. Two glowing orbs, reflecting the light of my flashlight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move at first. It just stared at me, its eyes locked onto mine through the glass. And then, slowly, it began to move. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away from the window, my mind racing. My heart was in my throat, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But before I could even consider my next move, the scratching started again. Louder, more frantic this time. It was on the window now, like something was trying to get inside. I ran to the door, my mind screaming at me to leave. But when I opened it, there was nothing. The yard was empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves. I closed the door and locked it, my heart still pounding. What the hell had I seen? Part 5, The Escape. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. Whatever was out there, whatever I had seen, was not something I could handle. I packed my things in a frenzy, moving quickly and desperately to get out of there. The drive down the narrow, winding road felt like it took forever. The air around the cabin seemed to weigh down on me, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching behind me. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a sense of relief. The cabin was far behind me now. The weight lifted, and I could breathe again. I made it to a small town a few hours later, exhausted and shaken. I checked into a hotel, trying to calm myself down. But no matter how many times I told myself it was over, the memory of those glowing eyes haunted me. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, but the scratches on the cabin's walls, the figure in the moonlight, and the feeling of being watched never truly left me. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe something else was out there in those woods. All I know is that I won't be going back to that cabin, ever. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. I had been craving peace, solitude, and the chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. So, when I found an old cabin in the woods, I figured it was perfect. Just a weekend to clear my head and enjoy some fresh air, away from the noise of the city. The cabin was nestled deep in a forest, far from any roads or neighbors. The drive out there had been long, winding through miles of trees and hills, but the final stretch had been beautiful. I had to leave my car by the side of the narrow dirt path and walk the last half mile or so. It was the kind of walk that made you feel like you were entering another world, where everything around you seemed untouched by time. The cabin itself was small but cozy, a two-story structure with rough-hewn logs for walls, a steep roof, and a porch that creaked underfoot when I stepped onto it. The door was solid, made of thick oak with a brass knocker that had likely seen better days. Inside, it was just as you'd expect from a place so isolated, nothing fancy. The floors were wooden, creaky, and uneven, and the furniture was old but functional. A fireplace stood at one end of the main room, surrounded by chairs and a simple wooden table. It didn't take long for me to settle in. The first thing I did was light a fire, filling the cabin with warmth as the chill of the evening crept in. I opened the windows to let in the cool mountain air, but there was something strange about the silence outside. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that I had imagined. It was deeper, almost oppressive, like the kind of silence that feels unnatural. The trees surrounding the cabin were tall and thick, their branches heavy with leaves that rustled occasionally in the breeze. But aside from that, there was nothing. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation. I was in the middle of nowhere after all, but it didn't sit right with me. The first night passed without incident. The fire crackled, the wind howled around the cabin, and I slept well enough, though I kept waking up to strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I started hearing something else, something more deliberate. Footsteps outside, soft and slow, like someone was pacing around the cabin. I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a deer or something. After all, there were plenty of wildlife in the area. But when I woke up a second time to those same footsteps, I felt a twinge of unease. Still, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. The next day, I went for a hike. The air was crisp, the trees vibrant with color, and the ground beneath my boots was soft with fallen leaves. But the longer I walked, the more I noticed something odd. The further I went from the cabin, the more I could hear the faintest sound of something moving behind me. Every time I stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. It was subtle, like a distant rustling or the sound of feet dragging across the ground. It was unnerving, but I didn't want to let it ruin my trip. I picked up the pace, eventually reaching a clearing with a small stream running through it. I sat down on a large rock, trying to push aside the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. I watched the water for a while, listening to the soft rush of it as it flowed over the rocks. But when I stood up to leave, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There were fresh footprints in the mud. Large, heavy prints like someone had been walking through the clearing. The prints were deep, as if the person had been carrying something heavy, or perhaps just stepping with great force. I knew I had been alone on the hike. I was sure of it. I hadn't seen a single person, and the only sounds I had heard had been the wind and the occasional bird. But here were these footprints, clear and unmistakable. I quickly turned and made my way back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just someone else hiking in the area, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong here. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trees. I could feel the unease growing, like something was watching me. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure they were all locked, though I knew deep down that locks wouldn't do much to keep out whatever was out there. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too methodical. That night, I kept the lights on, the fire burning bright, and tried to ignore the nagging sense of dread that settled in my gut. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just overreacting, imagining things. But then, around midnight, the footsteps returned. Soft at first, then louder as though whoever or whatever it was had come closer. I froze in place, straining my ears to listen. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat bead on the back of my neck. I wanted to call out, to shout at whoever was out there, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stayed silent, listening, waiting for the next sound. It was so close now, I could almost feel the weight of it pressing against the walls of the cabin. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy metal flashlight, and moved cautiously toward the window. I peered out into the darkness, but all I could see was the dim outline of the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing unusual, no figure, no sign of anyone. But then, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. For a moment, it was barely a blur, just a flicker against the dark outline of the trees, but it was there, something large moving steadily away from the cabin. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and everything I could carry, and rushed out of the cabin. My car was parked half a mile away, but I wasn't taking any chances. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck here, alone with whatever had been outside. The walk to the car felt longer than it should have. Every step seemed to echo, and I could hear that sound again, the same dragging footsteps, this time following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I dared not look behind me. I just kept walking, faster now, the car just in sight. I reached it, fumbled for the keys, and got inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't waste a second. I started the car and drove off without looking back. As I made my way down the narrow dirt road, I kept my eyes on the headlights, not daring to look at the trees. But something inside me knew I had narrowly escaped something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I didn't want to find out. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small diner. I sat down, trying to calm my nerves, and told the waitress what had happened, though I left out most of the details. She looked at me for a moment, then said something that chilled me more than anything that had happened in the woods. "Yeah, that cabin. You're not the first to feel something strange out there. People say it's been abandoned for years, but every once in a while, someone comes through. They say there's something about that place, like it's not meant to be lived in." I left shortly after, not staying to hear more. But one thing was clear: I wasn't going back. I rented a cabin in Colorado last fall. I live in Denver, and after a rough year, my job, my divorce, and my mental health taking hits, I just wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city and from people. I didn't want to hear car alarms or sirens. I didn't want to see neighbors. I wanted silence, space, and a place where I could breathe. I didn't need anything fancy, just something quiet. I found a listing through a site that catered to people looking for isolated retreats. The description said the place was off-grid, peaceful, and miles from the nearest paved road. That's exactly what I was looking for. It was a 2-room log cabin set deep in the San Juan Mountains. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. According to the description, there was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, and the nearest town was a 40-minute drive. The owners provided wood for the stove, propane for cooking, and a large cooler with ice for food storage. There was a small hand pump for water and a composting toilet in a shed out back. It sounded simple, quiet, and perfect. I packed light: canned food, dried stuff, a sleeping bag, some books, a knife, a flashlight with backup batteries, my journal, and a handgun I keep locked away at home, just for peace of mind. I'm not someone who thinks they'll ever need to use it, but I've had it since my dad gave it to me after college. I've never had to fire it at anything living. Still, the cabin's remoteness made me throw it in the bag. The drive there was long and winding. After the last gas station in town, I followed a dirt road up through the trees for nearly an hour. There were no signs, just GPS coordinates and a small map the owner emailed me. I saw maybe 2 other trucks the entire time. I got there around 4 in the afternoon. The air felt different, cleaner, colder, sharper. The cabin sat alone in a wide clearing, surrounded by towering trees that looked like they hadn't moved for centuries. There was a small fire pit in front, a bench, and a little shed about 30 yards behind it. That was the composting toilet. The inside was even smaller than the pictures made it look. There was a single bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and some shelves with pots, pans, and basic tools. No electricity, just oil lamps and a big stack of split firewood outside. I unloaded everything, made myself some instant noodles, and watched the sky darken. The silence was heavier than I expected. In the city, you think you know what silence is. Out there, it felt thick, the kind of quiet where you can hear your heart in your chest. That first night, I slept hard. There was something comforting about being tucked into a small, dark space in the middle of nowhere. The wind in the trees, the crackling stove. It was everything I wanted. I woke up around 6 a.m. the next morning. It was cold. I got the stove going, made some coffee with my little camp pot, and sat outside. No sounds but birds and the wind. I spent the day hiking around, keeping track of my steps on a cheap pedometer. I had no GPS or compass, but I didn't wander too far, maybe 3 miles out and back. The land rolled up and down, thick with trees and mossy rocks. The trails weren't marked, but I paid close attention and kept landmarks in my mind. Fallen logs, rock piles, crooked trees. That night, after dinner, I sat outside again. It was colder than the night before. I heard coyotes in the distance, not close. Their calls echoed through the trees like ghosts, but I didn't feel afraid. They were far off, and I had my food stored high in a tree like the cabin guide suggested. The third day started to feel different. Not bad, but different. I noticed a path I hadn't seen before, narrow, pressed down like it was made from game or hikers. It led north, away from where I'd been walking before. I followed it for a bit, but stopped when I noticed something odd. There were boot prints. Not fresh, but not that old either. They weren't mine, and I hadn't seen another person since leaving the highway. Still, it didn't mean much. Could have been someone hunting a week ago. I turned around and headed back. That night, something woke me up around 2 a.m. It wasn't loud, just a sound, soft and deliberate, like a footstep. Then another, not an animal. I know what deer or raccoons sound like. This was weighty, slow, human. I stayed in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. The cabin door was locked. I kept the handgun next to my bag under the bed. I waited. After maybe 5 minutes, the steps stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came. I checked around the cabin. No signs of anything. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles. No snow yet, so I couldn't make out tracks. I told myself it was probably an animal, and I imagined the pace. I tried to believe that. The 5th day is when things started to unravel. I went to check the shed in the back, just out of habit. That's when I saw it. Scratches on the wood. Deep, straight, vertical marks. 5 of them spaced like fingers. At first, I thought it was a bear or maybe someone fooling around. But they were clean, deliberate, not random like an animal would make. It looked more like someone had dragged a metal rake straight down the side. There were no tracks, no fur, nothing. Later that afternoon, I saw something in the woods. I was collecting kindling about 50 yards from the cabin. I turned around and saw a shape between the trees, tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing dark clothes. Not moving, just standing. Watching. I froze. I looked down for just a second, just to step around a rock. And when I looked back, it was gone. I hurried back to the cabin and stayed inside the rest of the day. I kept the handgun nearby. That night, I didn't light the stove. I didn't want the smoke giving away my position. I sat in the dark, eyes fixed on the door. Nothing happened. No sounds. No movement. The next morning, I made a decision to leave early. I still had 3 days left, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed what I could, filled my cooler with what was left, and locked the door behind me. But when I got to my truck, the tires were slashed. All 4, not torn or popped, slashed clean through. Long cuts. Someone had used a blade. My chest tightened. I looked around, scanned the trees. Nothing. Not a bird, not a branch moving. Just stillness. I walked around the clearing, checking for more signs, tracks, tools, anything. But there was nothing but silence and cold. I had no signal, no cell reception. The nearest town was 20-something miles away, and I had no spare tire, no inflator. I was stuck. I went back inside, locked the door, sat on the floor with the gun. My mind ran wild. What if someone was trying to mess with me? What if they were waiting? That day passed like a dream. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. Every sound outside felt too loud. Every creak of the cabin made my stomach turn. At sunset, I heard it again. Steps. Same pacing. Slow. Heavy. Right outside the cabin. I stayed still, gun in hand, pointing toward the door. The steps circled the cabin once. Then silence. Then a knock. Not loud. Just a single knock. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I stayed there until daylight. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my bag light, just water, food, my pistol, and a flare I found in the emergency kit under the bed. I left the rest behind. I figured I could hike out and find help. I started walking around 7 a.m. I followed the dirt road, heading back toward the direction I came. I moved fast. Every sound behind me made me turn. No cars, no hikers, just the road, the trees, and me. By noon, my legs ached. I covered maybe 12 miles. That's when I saw tire tracks, fresh ones. I followed them, and within 30 minutes, I came across a truck parked on the side of the road. There was a man inside, older, wearing a hunter's vest. He looked confused when I came out of the trees waving my hands. He gave me a ride into town. I didn't tell him everything, just that my tires had been slashed and I needed help. He didn't ask much. just shook his head and said, "Some weird people out here sometimes." At the gas station in town, I called a tow company. It took 4 hours to get back up to the cabin with the truck. When we got there, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, everything was gone through. My bag, my food, my journal, even the small pile of firewood. The bed was flipped. My clothes were thrown all over. The flare was gone. The handgun was gone. The guy towing the truck said, "Looks like you scared someone off before they could take more." I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, looking at the wreck of a place that had felt like a safe escape a few days ago. I never went back. I filed a report with the county, but nothing came of it. No fingerprints, no leads. The cabin owner refunded my money and apologized. He said no one had ever reported anything like that before. I didn't care. I was done with cabins. Now, even in my apartment, I lock the door twice. I keep the blinds closed. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just a few days to escape the chaos of everyday life, get some fresh air, and enjoy the quiet of nature. I'd rented an old, secluded cabin up in the mountains, miles away from any towns. I had been searching for somewhere isolated for weeks, and this place seemed perfect. The photos online were charming: old wood, big windows, and an enormous fireplace. It was the ideal spot to disconnect. I had been feeling burnt out lately. Work was overwhelming, and I needed a break. I invited a couple of friends, but none of them were able to make it, so I ended up going alone. That was fine with me. I'd always preferred time alone in nature anyway. The cabin was exactly as I had imagined. The drive up there had been long, winding through narrow, poorly maintained roads, but I didn't mind. The weather had been clear, and the sun was setting as I reached the driveway. The trees surrounding the place were thick, casting long shadows over the cabin, but it all felt peaceful. I unlocked the door with the key hidden under a rock near the porch. The inside was cozy, a little dusty, but it had that rustic charm. The large stone fireplace took up most of one wall, and there were wooden beams across the ceiling. I immediately felt at ease, despite the odd sense of isolation. I unpacked quickly, put some wood on the fire, and set up a small table by the window, where I could enjoy the view of the forest below. The first night was calm. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. I had brought some books, a notebook, and a guitar. I spent most of the evening reading by the fire, feeling the warmth and watching the shadows flicker on the walls. But as the night wore on, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. At first, it was just small stuff, like how the fire would shift and pop unexpectedly, or how the floorboards creaked when there was no one around. But the longer I stayed there, the more I felt something was off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a growing sense of discomfort. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the old house settling. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But there was something about this place that seemed too still. That night, I woke up to the sound of a loud bang coming from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring into the dark room. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe a pot had fallen, or something had shifted in the cupboards. But I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, listening. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. I went back to sleep, but the sound lingered in the back of my mind. I kept thinking I could hear something, just faintly. A scraping sound, almost like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. But it didn't happen again, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I was on edge, but I forced myself to shake it off. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The view was breathtaking, and for a moment, I felt better. The air was fresh, the birds were chirping, and there was nothing but forest around me. I spent the day exploring the area. The cabin was surrounded by dense trees, with a small creek running nearby. There was a trail that led through the woods, and I followed it, taking in the scenery and trying to relax. But no matter how hard I tried, there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. It was as if something was watching me, By the time evening came, I was tired and ready to settle in for the night. I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed it by the fire, the warmth of the flames comforting me. I tried to push the feeling of unease from my mind, but it wouldn't go away. The night was so quiet, too quiet. No wind, no sounds of animals in the distance, just an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I woke up around midnight, the feeling of something being off stronger than before. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there, staring into the darkness. There was no sound at all, not even the usual creaks of the house settling. The air felt heavy. I got up, deciding to check the place out. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I needed to be sure. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked through the living room, the only light coming from the dim glow of the dying fire. The kitchen was dark, the windows black with the night. I walked over to the kitchen and turned on the light. Nothing seemed out of place. The counters were clear, the dishes still stacked as I had left them earlier. But then I noticed something strange. A chair, one of the wooden chairs at the small dining table, was pushed slightly away from the table, as though someone had gotten up from it just moments before. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been in the kitchen since I cooked dinner. I hadn't touched that chair. I quickly glanced around the room, checking the back door, the windows, but everything seemed normal except for the chair. It was out of place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. I stood there for a moment, frozen. I listened for any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything, but there was nothing, just the low hum of the cabin settling. I pushed the chair back into place and left the kitchen, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I decided to lock all the doors, including the small side door that led to the porch. Even though I was alone, the feeling of being watched was becoming unbearable. I turned off the lights and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, each sound outside seeming louder than the last. Every time a twig snapped in the forest, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. It was like the darkness outside had a life of its own, and it was closing in on me. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. But when I went outside, I saw nothing. Just the same peaceful landscape, the trees swaying in the wind, and the creek bubbling quietly nearby. I didn't stay another night. It wasn't that I was scared. I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, but I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had been growing since I arrived. The feeling that something was off, that I wasn't truly alone, weighed too heavily on me. I packed up my things, locked the cabin behind me, and drove away. The road back down the mountain felt endless. I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I shook the thought away, telling myself it was just the stress of being alone out there. But deep down, I knew something had been wrong with that cabin. When I got back to town, I looked up the cabin online, thinking maybe I had missed something. Maybe there had been a report about it, some history I didn't know about. But I found nothing. It was as if the cabin had just appeared out of nowhere. No previous guests had left reviews, and there was no mention of the area in any news stories. It was like it didn't exist before I had found it. I never went back. Years later, I still think about that weekend. I don't know what happened or what I felt out there, but I can't deny the unease that gripped me. The isolation, the silence, the way the place seemed too still. It all felt wrong. I learned to trust my instincts after that, to never ignore that creeping feeling that something isn't quite right. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear a faint scraping sound, like something moving across the floor. But when I wake up, there's nothing there. Just the dark, empty room. I don't really like being around people too much. I work a remote job, I don't go out much, and I've always been the kind of person who finds peace in quiet places. When you spend so much of your life surrounded by people, noise, cars, and flashing lights, it all starts to feel like it's pressing down on your chest. So sometimes I just need to get away from it all. A few months ago, I booked a small cabin in northern Michigan. It was way out in the woods, sitting on the edge of a frozen lake, probably 4 or 5 hours away from the nearest city. The photos made it look like exactly what I needed. Snow-covered pines, an old wooden cabin with a fireplace, a small dock reaching out onto the ice. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just a couple solar panels and a backup generator. I was excited to unplug and just breathe. I planned everything down to the hour. I made a grocery run the day before, enough canned stuff, water, batteries, matches, and instant coffee to last me a week. I packed 2 heavy coats, thermals, gloves, a hat, and a new pair of boots I bought just for the trip. I even printed out a map of the area since GPS would be useless out there. The drive up was calm. Long stretches of empty highway, snow on the shoulder, thick forests on both sides. It felt like I was slowly driving out of the world I knew and into something quiet and still. As I got closer to the cabin, the roads narrowed into old Forest Service roads, covered in fresh snow. My tires crunched over it, and there were no other tracks. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked just like the photos. Maybe better. It was tucked between 2 thick tree lines, the front porch covered in a soft white layer of snow, a small metal chimney poking out the roof. The lake behind it was flat and frozen solid, the surface white with snow. Not a single sound. I stepped out of the car and just stood there for a minute, letting the cold air fill my lungs. It felt like I was the only person on Earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was cold but clean. The place had been kept up pretty well. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace with a pile of logs stacked beside it, a couch that looked like it had been there for 30 years, and a little wooden dining table. A ladder led up to a small loft with a mattress on the floor. The windows were thick and slightly fogged from the cold. No curtains, just the glass. Everything smelled like old pine and dust. The first couple of days went by without anything unusual. I split wood, kept the fire going, read books, wrote in my notebook, and went for short hikes through the woods during the day. I didn't go too far from the cabin, though. The snow was thick and deep, and I didn't want to get turned around. I left marks on trees with red ribbon and made sure to always take the same path out and back. I saw deer tracks in the snow, a rabbit once, and even a fox. The animals out there didn't seem to care much about me. It was on the 3rd day that I noticed something weird. I was coming back from a short hike near the lake when I saw footprints in the snow that weren't mine. They were human, for sure. Big, deep boot prints. At first, I thought maybe they were old, maybe left by the person who came to clean the cabin before me. But they were too fresh. They hadn't been there when I left just a couple hours earlier. They started from the tree line near the west end of the lake and led straight toward the cabin, then doubled back and disappeared into the woods again. I followed them with my eyes and realized they had stopped just a few feet from the porch before turning back. Not a full loop around the cabin. No prints on the backside, just up to the porch and then away again. It unsettled me, but I told myself it could have been a hunter or a lost hiker. Maybe someone who saw smoke from my chimney and thought they'd check it out but changed their mind. It was rare to run into people out there, but not impossible. I stood outside for a while, looking toward the trees, listening. Nothing moved. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of my boots as I went inside and locked the door. That night, I couldn't sleep very well. I kept listening for sounds. Footsteps on the porch, someone walking through the snow, but it stayed quiet. Too quiet. I kept a fire going, but it didn't help much. I stayed in the loft with my sleeping bag zipped all the way up, staring at the ceiling, wide awake until dawn. The next day, I looked for more prints but didn't see any. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, and everything was smooth and white again. I went about my day as usual, but I kept checking the woods. I didn't hike far that time, just stayed close and chopped more wood. My nerves were starting to fray. That night, something woke me up. I don't know what it was, just a feeling, I guess. I sat up in the loft, heart racing, and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I realized the fire had burned out. I could see my breath in the air. It was freezing. I climbed down and put more logs into the fireplace, then lit a match and brought it to the kindling. It crackled quietly, and the room started to fill with the warm glow again. That's when I heard a creak on the porch. just one. A single wooden creak like someone had stepped on the edge of a board. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. I reached over and slowly turned off the lantern, so the only light in the room came from the fire. I crouched low and crawled over to the window, careful not to let my silhouette show. I pulled back the corner of the blanket I had hung up as a makeshift curtain. I couldn't see anything out there, just the porch railing and the trees beyond. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, barely breathing. No more sounds, no movement. I finally went back to the loft, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there, eyes open, heart thudding in my chest. The next morning, I found the prints again. They came from the trees, same place as before, walked up to the porch, and this time they went all the way around the cabin. I counted the steps. Someone had walked around my cabin at least twice, maybe more. They'd stepped right up to each window. I saw the deep boot print right under the loft window, where I had been lying the night before. Whoever it was had stood right there, looking in. I felt sick. My stomach tightened. I wanted to believe it was just some guy, maybe a trapper or a hunter who got curious, but why would they come at night? Why would they walk all the way around the cabin, twice, without knocking or making their presence known? I didn't have cell service, but I had a shortwave radio in my gear. I tried to use it to call for help, but I couldn't get through to anyone. I don't even know if I was doing it right. I had never actually needed to use it before. That afternoon, I packed my bag. I wanted to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The engine just clicked. The battery was dead. I opened the hood and saw the cable to the battery had been pulled loose. It didn't look chewed through, no signs of animals. It looked like someone had yanked it off. I reconnected it, but the engine still wouldn't turn over. My hands were shaking as I slammed the hood shut. I was stuck. I stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the day. I blocked the doors with furniture. I turned off the lights and just sat there in the dark with a knife in my lap and my back against the wall. I watched the windows until my eyes ached. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, I didn't get up. I just sat there, breathing shallowly, praying they wouldn't try the door. The footsteps circled the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. Morning came and the prints were there again. More this time, at least 3 different sets, maybe 4. I could tell by the shapes and sizes. They had all come together, circled the cabin, then walked off into the woods. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I packed what I could carry and left a note inside the cabin with the date and time I left. I started walking using my map and compass, following the trail that had brought me in. It was slow going through the snow, but I didn't stop. Every now and then I looked back, but I never saw anyone following me. Still, I never shook the feeling that someone was close, watching from the trees. After 6 hours, I finally saw tire tracks, my own, and followed them back to the nearest service road. From there, I just kept walking until I saw a ranger's truck. I flagged him down, shaking from cold and fear, and told him everything. He drove me to the nearest outpost and called for help. They checked the cabin later that week, but no one was there. No new prints, no signs of who had been walking around it. They said they'd keep an eye on the area, but I never heard anything else. No arrests, no missing people, just nothing. I don't go into the woods anymore. I still need quiet sometimes, still need to get away, but I don't go anywhere alone. I don't trust silence like I used to. I used to think that getting away from people was the safest thing I could do. Now I know better. It was late October when I decided to head out to the woods alone. I had a few days off work, and I needed to get away from everything for a bit. I'd just gone through a rough breakup, and sitting around my apartment staring at my phone wasn't helping. I figured some quiet time out in nature might clear my head. A guy I worked with, Dan, had once told me about this small, isolated cabin his uncle owned near Mill Creek, tucked way back in the woods about a 3-hour drive south of where I lived in Indiana. Dan said his uncle never used it anymore, and when I asked about borrowing it, he just gave me the key and told me to bring it back when I was done. The drive there was long and winding. The roads got narrow after a while, and the further I got, the more alone I felt. No gas stations, no houses, nothing but trees and road. It was early afternoon when I got there. The cabin was small, just one floor, made of old wood that had gone dark from years of rain and sun. It sat right next to a shallow, slow-moving creek. The water was low that time of year, and the whole place felt still. Too still. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, just a small wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a cot with an old mattress. I brought my own sleeping bag, some food, water, a small camping stove, and a headlamp. I had a knife on me too, the kind you carry while hiking. I felt all right about being alone. I wasn't new to the woods. I'd done a fair amount of camping and backpacking in the past. But this place felt different, quiet in a way that almost made my ears ring. I settled in, walked around a bit before sunset, got familiar with the area. The trees were thick all around, mostly oak and maple, their leaves red and gold and halfway gone. I saw no trails, no signs of other people. That night, I sat by the creek and watched the sky go dark. It was peaceful, at least for a little while. The first night passed without much happening. I kept the fire going in the stove, ate some soup out of a can, and read a paperback by flashlight. I fell asleep easily enough. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling like something was off. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had this tight feeling in my chest like something was wrong. I lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it crunching leaves outside. It wasn't an animal. I know the sounds animals make, and this was slower, heavier, more like footsteps. I sat up and stayed quiet. The sound moved from behind the cabin to the side where the creek ran. Then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but there was nothing. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was covered in dry leaves, and I didn't see anything clear, but there were spots where it looked like something had definitely moved through. Could have been anything, I thought. I told myself not to be paranoid. I made coffee on my camping stove, sat on the little porch, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling. Later that day, I went deeper into the woods. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or so out. I didn't want to get lost, and I made sure to mark a few trees along the way with some orange tape I had in my pack. The forest was beautiful, but again, it was just so quiet. I kept expecting to hear birds or the wind moving through the trees, but it was dead silent, like the woods were holding their breath. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I noticed something weird. The small pile of firewood I'd stacked the day before, right by the door, was scattered. Not just fallen over, but spread out like someone had kicked it. I hadn't seen any animals during my walk. Nothing big enough to do that. I looked around again. Nothing. No sounds. No movement. I started to feel like maybe I wasn't alone out there. I didn't have cell service, of course. I'd expected that. But the feeling of being completely cut off started to weigh on me. That night, I brought my knife into the sleeping bag with me. I locked the door, even though it was just an old latch, and pushed one of the chairs up under the knob. I kept my flashlight close. The second night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. Same feeling in my chest, like something was watching me. This time I heard breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, right outside the cabin wall. Not just footsteps. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The breathing moved. It went from one side of the cabin to the front door. Then it stopped again. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there in the dark, not even daring to turn on the flashlight. Then the knob on the door rattled, soft like someone testing it, not trying to bust in, just checking. I stayed completely still. Whoever it was didn't knock or speak or do anything else. Just that one slow turn of the knob. Then silence again. Eventually, I heard the footsteps go off into the woods. Crunch, crunch, slower this time, like the person knew I was awake, like they were taking their time. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting up with the knife in my hand. I didn't even blink. Every little noise outside felt louder. Every shift of the wind made my heart skip. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't care if I had another day left. I wanted out. I loaded up my gear fast, barely eating, and locked up the cabin out of habit, though it felt pointless. I started down the narrow dirt road in my truck, trying to stay calm, trying to tell myself it was just some random hunter or hiker messing around. But in my gut, I knew that wasn't it. I hadn't passed another car or seen a single person since I got there. That place wasn't anywhere near a public trail or park. Whoever was out there, they came for a reason. The road back to town was long, and for a good hour, I didn't have a signal. When I finally got bars again, I pulled over and just sat there with the engine running. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of it. I kept thinking about the way the breathing moved around the cabin, the way the firewood had been scattered, the rattling doorknob. Back in town, I returned the key to Dan. I didn't say much, just handed it over and said thanks. He didn't ask anything, and I didn't offer. A few days later, I looked up Mill Creek and the surrounding area. I found a few old forum posts from years ago. Campers talking about weird things, hearing people at night, someone's tent being slashed while they were away hiking. Nothing official, nothing police-related. Just scattered comments, warnings from folks who'd been out there before. I don't know who was out there those nights. Maybe some drifter living in the woods. Maybe someone hunting more than deer. All I know is I won't ever go back to that cabin. I won't ever stay alone in a place that quiet again. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from cell towers and streetlights, remember, silence doesn't always mean you're alone. It started with a simple decision. A small cabin up in the hills, far from the noise of the city, seemed like the perfect place for a getaway. I needed a break, and I'd heard a lot about this cabin from a couple of friends who said it was isolated and peaceful, just a few miles from the nearest town. They didn't mention anything odd about it, just that it was tucked away in a quiet spot near a lake, surrounded by thick woods. They said it was the perfect place to disconnect. I rented the cabin for the weekend, just myself. I packed my bags, made sure I had plenty of snacks, and grabbed my old hiking boots for a little exploration. The road leading up to the cabin was gravel and narrow, winding through trees that almost seemed to lean in on each other. The further I drove, the more isolated it became. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, muffling everything except your own thoughts. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. The trees were dense, casting shadows on the cabin as if they were guarding it. The building itself was small, weathered wood with a stone chimney, a front porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and a small garden out back that had long since been overtaken by weeds. I didn't mind the mess. The place had a charm to it, a kind of rustic feel that made it seem more homey than a hotel would. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple, nothing too fancy. A small kitchen with a stove, a fridge that hummed quietly, a couch by the fireplace, and a table with a few chairs around it. The bedroom had a large bed with a thick quilt on top, old but sturdy wooden furniture. Everything smelled faintly of wood and something earthy, maybe dust or dried herbs. It was nice, calming, the kind of place where you could easily forget about the world outside. The first night, I was too tired to do much. I made some food, settled on the couch with a book, and lit the fire. It crackled and popped as I listened to the wind howl outside, the trees rustling in the storm that had started up after I arrived. The cabin felt warm and secure, a perfect escape from the city. But by the time the evening rolled around, I started noticing a few things. Little things at first. The house seemed to settle, creaking in places it shouldn't. There was a constant low noise, like the wind was pushing against the walls, but it wasn't outside. Felt more like the cabin itself was groaning. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me, I thought. I tried to ignore it and went to bed. That night, I woke up to the sound of something else, scratching. It was faint but steady, like claws dragging against wood. I sat up in bed, trying to focus. It wasn't the wind. The sound was coming from outside, near the porch. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel or something, but the sound continued. It was unsettling, more rhythmic than I thought any animal would be. I checked the time. It was nearly 2 a.m., too late for any sane creature to be that active. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped on my boots. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. but the curiosity was too strong. The night air was cool and crisp as I stepped outside. The wind had died down, leaving behind a heavy, almost suffocating silence. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing the porch and the area around it. There was nothing there. I shone the light around, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had made the noise, but there was nothing. Just the trees in the distance, the stillness of the night, and the faint smell of damp earth. I walked around the porch, my boots crunching against the gravel. As I passed by the corner of the cabin, I noticed something strange. A pile of rocks near the base of the building. Smooth stones that looked like they'd been placed there on purpose. I knelt down to examine them. It didn't seem like they belonged. There was no natural reason for a stack of rocks to be there, especially not that neatly arranged. I stood back up, a chill creeping up my spine. The scratching noise had stopped, but the air around me felt heavier now, more oppressive. I shone my flashlight back towards the cabin door, and I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The door was ajar. I was certain I had closed it before I went to bed. I could have sworn the door clicked shut when I last checked, but now it was slightly open, just enough to make me uneasy. I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. Who or what could have opened it? I stepped toward the door slowly, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. There was no sign of anyone around. No footsteps in the dirt. No sound from the trees. I pushed the door open gently and stepped inside, scanning the dark interior with the beam of my flashlight. Everything looked the same, but I could feel that sense of wrongness settle in the pit of my stomach. The fire was still burning in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Nothing had been disturbed except for the door itself. I locked the door behind me, telling myself that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night dragged on with no more disturbances, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I spent some time exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, and the trails were faint and overgrown. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of human activity, just trees, and the occasional glimpse of the lake through the branches. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, trying to push the strange events from the night before out of my mind. I felt better being outside in the fresh air, but the quiet of the place was overwhelming. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was starting to set again, casting long shadows across the land. As I approached the porch, I noticed something new. The rocks were gone. The stack of stones I had seen the night before was no longer there, as if someone had moved them. That's when it hit me. The whole place felt too empty, too still. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what to make of it, but I decided I'd leave the next day. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe I had been cooped up too long. But something about the cabin, the woods, the stillness, it all felt off. That night, as I sat by the fire, the scratching noise came back. But this time it was closer. It was definitely outside, near the porch again. But it wasn't just scratching. It sounded like something was moving, shuffling, dragging itself along the ground. I grabbed the flashlight again and headed out onto the porch. This time I wasn't just curious, I was scared. I shone the light around the yard, trying to make sense of the sounds. The beam landed on something in the shadows. A figure. It was crouched down near the steps of the porch, its face hidden in the darkness. It didn't move when I shone the light on it. For a long, tense moment, we just stood there. I was frozen in place, not knowing what to do. Then, the figure slowly stood up and took a step back. I could see now that it wasn't human. It was too large, too broad, and the way it moved, it didn't seem natural. I bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding. I locked every window, every door, and didn't move from the couch. I stayed up all night, listening to the occasional rustle outside, waiting for the sun to rise. When the morning light finally broke through, I packed my things in a rush. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. I wanted out of there. I left the cabin behind, driving down the gravel road with a sense of relief. I didn't know what that thing had been, or if I had imagined the whole thing, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I drove back toward the nearest town, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The cabin was just a small shape against the trees, hidden again in the distance. I never went back to that cabin, but I've always wondered about it. What was that thing outside? And why did it feel like the land around the cabin was holding something back, something waiting for the right moment? Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but I never felt so certain that I'd made the right decision to leave. I don't know if anyone else has stayed there since, but I'll never forget how it felt to be so utterly alone in that place. That was the only thought in my mind when I decided to take a solo trip to a small, off-grid cabin in the northern part of Minnesota, not too far from the Canadian border. I'd been working way too much, sleeping too little, and I felt like everything in my life was starting to blend together. I was snapping at people over nothing. I was tired all the time. I wasn't enjoying anything anymore. So I booked a week at this old rental cabin that sat deep in the woods, about 1.5 miles from the nearest road. The guy who owned it listed it as a true escape, and that's exactly what I was looking for. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just quiet, woods, and time to reset. I packed light but carefully. A sturdy backpack, some freeze-dried meals, a Jetboil stove, a few cans of soup, first aid kit, a knife, flashlight, solar charger, layers of clothes, and a small Ruger pistol I always brought on long trips into the wild. I wasn't really expecting to need it, but having it made me feel better. You never know out there. The drive up took almost 8 hours. By the time I got to the gravel road that led to the trailhead, the sun was already getting low. It was the kind of place where you didn't see another car for miles, and there weren't any street signs, just GPS coordinates and a vague description from the owner about a turn just past a split rail fence. The trail to the cabin wasn't marked either, just a narrow dirt path cutting into the trees, thick with pine needles and leaves. I hiked in fast, trying to beat sunset. The air was cold and sharp, and the woods were dead quiet except for the crunch of my boots. I saw deer tracks, and once I spotted a set of bear prints that looked a day or two old, but nothing fresh. The cabin finally appeared as the trees thinned out, sitting at the edge of a small, frozen lake, surrounded by pines that leaned in close like they were trying to keep a secret. It was small but sturdy. Dark wood, pitched roof, stone chimney, one window in the front, and a single wooden step-up to a screen door. Inside was what you'd expect. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with wool blankets, some shelves with old books, a few pots and pans, and a battery-powered lantern. There was no electricity, no running water, and the outhouse was about 20 yards out back, half hidden by trees. I got the fire going and unpacked. I ate a quick dinner, just a packet of chili mac and a granola bar, and sat for a long time listening to the wood crackle. Felt good. Felt like what I needed. No buzzing, no notifications, no voices. Just quiet. The first 2 days were exactly what I hoped for. I hiked around during the day, explored the edges of the lake, took pictures of animal tracks in the snow, and sometimes just sat by the fire staring out the window. At night, I cooked, read, and slept hard. It got cold, real cold, but I had layered up and brought a sleeping bag rated for deep winter. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The third morning started strange. When I went out to use the outhouse, I noticed tracks. Not deer, not bear boot prints. They were fresh. They came from the east, out of the woods, circled the cabin once, and then disappeared back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out if they could be mine. But they were too big, and the stride was longer than mine. Plus, I always approached the cabin from the west, where the trail came in. These came from the opposite direction. I looked around the trees, but I didn't see anyone. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through, though it was private land and there were no trespassing signs posted along the trail. Still, it wasn't that crazy. Hunters wander. Sometimes they get turned around. I tried not to let it bother me. I spent the day chopping wood, hiking a short loop to the south, and keeping my eyes open. I didn't see or hear anything else out of place. That night, I locked the door, which I hadn't done the first 2 nights, and I kept the Ruger within reach. I slept a little lighter, but nothing happened. The next day, though, I went out to check the tracks again and found something that made my stomach twist. A piece of fishing line was tied around the handle of the outhouse. It stretched out into the woods, almost invisible unless the light caught it just right. I followed it about 10 yards before it vanished behind a tree. I didn't go any further. I cut the line and brought it back with me. It was thin and strong. Whoever tied it up was setting something up. Maybe a trap, maybe a warning system. Either way, it wasn't normal. I sat inside the cabin for a long time thinking. Part of me wanted to pack up and hike out, but I hadn't seen anyone else, and the trail was long. If someone was messing with me, they'd be out there, and I wasn't sure if walking a mile and a half alone through the woods was safer than staying put. I still had food and water. I could lock the door. I had a weapon. I decided to stay one more night, keep alert, and head out first thing in the morning if anything else happened. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound outside made me jump. I kept the lantern off and sat by the window watching the woods. Just after midnight, I heard something, a soft crunch in the snow, then another, slow footsteps moving just beyond the edge of the trees. I waited, heart hammering in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps circled the cabin again. Then they stopped. I sat there in the dark for over an hour, not hearing anything else. When the first light started to show, I finally grabbed my pack and got ready to leave. I stuffed everything in, killed the fire, and kept the gun out in my hand. I stepped outside slowly, looking in every direction. There were more tracks now, fresh boot prints right up to the door. They hadn't knocked. They just stood there. I didn't waste time. I followed the trail out, moving fast. My eyes were scanning constantly, listening for anything. I was maybe halfway to the road when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A small pile of broken branches stacked across the trail, like a makeshift marker. I stepped around it and kept going. Another 100 yards, I saw something else. A glove, just one. A heavy winter glove, left right in the middle of the path. It didn't look dropped. It looked placed. My gut was screaming now. I started moving faster. I was sweating despite the cold, my heart racing, every snap of a twig making me turn my head. That's when I saw them. Two men, maybe 40 yards off the trail, standing between the trees. They weren't moving, just watching me. One had a thick jacket and a hood pulled up. The other wore a tan coat and had a beard. I froze for a second. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. They just stood there. Then the one in the tan coat started walking toward me, not fast, slow and steady. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, full sprint. I don't remember breathing. I just ran. The snow was shallow but slippery, and the trail twisted, but I didn't stop. I could hear crashing in the woods behind me. Someone running too, trying to keep up but having trouble through the underbrush. I finally saw my car. I burst out of the woods, hit the gravel, and threw myself into the driver's seat. The second I was in, I locked the doors, turned the key, and reversed so hard I almost backed into a tree. I slammed into drive and peeled out down the road, tires skidding on gravel, mud spraying. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't look back. I drove to the nearest town, a tiny place with a gas station and a diner, and parked in the lot. I sat there for a while trying to calm down. I thought about calling the sheriff, but I didn't have anything solid. No one had touched me. No one had said anything. Just tracks, fishing line, staring, following. But it was enough for me. I didn't go back for the rest of my stuff. I didn't contact the cabin owner. I left a review later that just said, "Be aware. I had a strange experience here. Nothing more." I didn't want to deal with questions or explain what happened. It took me weeks to sleep normally again. I kept the gun near me at night, and I flinched every time I heard a noise outside. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. Maybe they were squatters. Maybe they were hunters who didn't like outsiders. Maybe they were something worse. But I got out. I haven't been on a solo trip since then. I still love the woods and I still go hiking, but I stay close to towns, and I don't stay in cabins where no one can hear me scream. I still think about that fishing line, tied so carefully, stretched out into the woods like a spider waiting for movement. That was the moment I knew this wasn't some accident. Someone had been watching. Someone had planned. Whatever they wanted, they didn't get it. had always been a fan of getting away from it all. Growing up in the city, I needed to escape every now and then. So when a friend recommended a cabin up in the woods for a weekend getaway, I was all in. The place sounded perfect, isolated, quiet, and far away from the noise of modern life. Just a little cabin tucked away in the thick trees, about a 3-hour drive from the city. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and nature. I packed my bags the night before, throwing in everything I thought I might need. Clothes, snacks, a couple of books, and a flashlight just in case. My car was in good shape, so I wasn't too worried about the drive. It was a simple route, just straight highways until I got close to the woods. That's when the real fun began. The cabin was only accessible by an old dirt road, not exactly a highway or even a regular road. More of a trail that cars could handle if they were sturdy enough. The closer I got to the cabin, the fewer houses I saw, and the thicker the trees seemed to get. I liked that. It made the place feel like a true retreat. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was just as I had imagined. A small, 2-story place with a porch that wrapped around the front. The wood was dark from age, and the windows were small and somewhat covered in grime, but it looked cozy, almost like something out of an old photo album, weathered but charming. I grabbed my bags and stepped out of the car, taking in a deep breath of the cool, crisp air. No cars, no people, just the wind rustling through the trees. Inside, the cabin was a lot more spacious than I had thought. The first floor had a living room area with a big stone fireplace, a small kitchen tucked to the side, and a tiny bathroom off the hallway. The second floor had a loft with a bed and a small window that overlooked the forest. The entire place smelled like pine and old wood, the kind of smell that feels like it's been there for decades. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved around, and the walls seemed to groan with the weight of time. I set my things down and decided to make myself at home, unpacking a bit and getting a fire going in the fireplace. The crackling sound of the wood burning was comforting, almost like a lullaby. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling through the leaves, but it wasn't enough to make me feel uneasy. In fact, it felt nice, the kind of peace you can't get in the city. I opened the back door to the porch and stepped out to watch the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I felt completely at ease. As the night wore on, I settled in, cooking a simple dinner in the small kitchen and eating at the wooden table by the window. The cabin felt more like home with every passing hour. After dinner, I cleaned up and decided to take a walk around the property before it got too dark. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. The land around the cabin was thick with trees, but there was a small clearing not too far away. I headed in that direction, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves underfoot. The flashlight beam danced in front of me, illuminating patches of the forest floor. There was something peaceful about the isolation, but also something unsettling. The trees were so dense, and the shadows they cast were deep. It felt like I was the only living thing in miles of woods. The silence was almost oppressive, but it was the kind of silence I had been craving. No cars, no people, just the sounds of nature. I reached the clearing, which was a small meadow-like area, bordered by thick trees. I stood there for a moment, looking out over the land, letting the tranquility wash over me. I could hear the wind picking up again, this time stronger, but it wasn't the wind that made me uneasy. It was the stillness that came before it. The quiet was almost too perfect, too absolute. It felt like the world had paused for a moment, and in that brief silence, something was missing. Something was wrong. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, and turned to head back to the cabin. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Footprints. I didn't think much of it at first, but they weren't my footprints. I had been the only one out there, right? The prints were fresh, pressed into the soft earth of the trail. A quick glance told me they were human, but not mine. They were too large. I froze in my tracks, shining the flashlight over them. There were several sets, leading deeper into the trees. I stepped closer, my heart beginning to race. It was weird, there was no sound. No animals, no rustling leaves. Just an eerie quiet, I followed the tracks, the beam of the flashlight jumping around nervously as I looked for any sign of who or what had left them. They led me in a half circle, back toward the edge of the clearing, and then disappeared into the brush. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. It was an odd mix of curiosity and fear, something I couldn't shake. I quickly turned and headed back to the cabin. I didn't know why, but I felt the need to lock the door behind me. As I entered, I checked the windows and pulled the blinds down. I had a feeling that, for some reason, someone might be out there, watching. The night passed without incident, but the unease didn't go away. I stayed up for hours, staring at the fire, listening to the wind howling outside. Every now and then, I would hear a rustling noise from the direction of the trees, but each time I looked out the window, I saw nothing. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, but a small part of me didn't believe that. By morning, I had little sleep, but I convinced myself it was time to head out for a hike. The sunlight seemed to chase away some of the tension, and I thought maybe the exercise would clear my mind. I grabbed my backpack, packed some snacks, and headed out. The weather was clear, the air fresh, and the trees smelled even better in the daylight. I walked along the same trail I had taken the night before, only this time, I tried not to think too much about the footprints. They had to be from someone else, maybe someone staying nearby. There were cabins scattered here and there in the woods, though none as close as mine. I tried to reassure myself, but as I walked deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched started creeping back in. It was subtle at first, just a faint sensation like someone was standing just out of sight. I turned around a few times, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I knew it was probably my imagination, but the sense of unease grew stronger. I decided to turn around and head back to the cabin. That's when I noticed it, something moving between the trees, just on the edge of my vision. I stopped in my tracks, staring into the shadows. I couldn't see clearly, but I was sure I saw a figure. Not clearly enough to make out details, but enough to make my stomach twist. I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move any closer, and after a few moments, it was gone. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt stupid for being scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I bolted the door once I was inside, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation for what I had seen. No one was supposed to be out here, and yet, there was something out there. It didn't feel right. I spent the rest of the day inside, checking the locks every few minutes, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a branch outside. The hours dragged on, and I finally decided that I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. It wasn't the footprints, and it wasn't the figure I thought I saw. It was the overwhelming feeling of being watched, of not being alone in a place that was supposed to be isolated. By evening, I had packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and locked the cabin door behind me. I wasn't taking any chances. I drove away in a hurry, my car bumping over the dirt road as I left the woods behind. As I reached the main highway, the sense of relief washed over me. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. It took me a while to shake off the uneasy feeling that lingered even after I returned to the city. I don't know if it was just my imagination running wild or if there was something truly strange going on in those woods, but I never went back. Some things, I guess, are better left unexplored. It started as a break, just a week away from everything. I was 36, burnt out from work, and feeling like my body was carrying a decade more than it should. My doctor told me my blood pressure was too high, and my boss told me my deadlines were falling behind. Both were probably right. I just needed to step back for a bit, so I booked a remote cabin in northern Michigan. It wasn't one of those fancy Airbnb cabins with Wi-Fi and hot tubs. It was old, basic, and quiet. I found it listed on an outdated website that catered to backwoods rentals. Places with no cell service, no internet, and no distractions. That was exactly what I wanted. The photos showed a one-room wooden cabin tucked between tall trees, with a small front porch and a fire pit out back. The listing said there was a generator for lights and a propane stove for cooking. No running water, but there was a well and a hand pump about 30 feet from the door. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and you had to drive down a 2-mile dirt road just to reach the cabin. Sounded perfect. I drove up on a Monday afternoon in late October. The leaves had mostly fallen, and the air was cold but not freezing yet. I packed my truck with groceries, bottled water, a couple coolers, a gas can, and enough books and notebooks to keep me busy. I also brought my old hunting rifle. I hadn't hunted in years, but it felt smart to have something for protection, just in case a bear or some other animal came too close. The road to the cabin was rough. My truck bounced around over deep ruts and wet leaves, and I had to take it slow the last half-mile. Felt like I was driving into nothing. The trees thickened, and the sun disappeared early behind the hills. But then I saw the cabin, just like the pictures. Plain wood, maybe 60 years old. A rusted metal chimney poked out the top, and a tiny porch sagged toward the dirt. It was quiet. I stepped out and just stood there, breathing in that cold, clean air. No cars, no voices, no buzzing from my phone. Just the trees and the wind. Inside, it smelled like dust and wood smoke. There was a cot in the corner with a thin mattress, a small table and 2 chairs, some shelves with old cookware, and a single light bulb hanging from a cord in the ceiling. The generator sat outside behind the cabin, and after filling it with gas and giving it a pull, it rumbled to life. The light flickered on and I smiled. The first night was peaceful. I made a simple meal on the propane stove, canned chili and instant rice, and read a few chapters of an old mystery novel I brought. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak and moan, but it didn't bother me. I was warm inside my sleeping bag on the cot, and the silence was a relief. It was the second night that something felt off. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound. Not loud, just different. It wasn't the wind or a raccoon knocking over something. It sounded like footsteps, slow, careful ones. On the porch, I sat up and listened. My heart was already beating faster. I waited, holding my breath. There it was again. A soft creak, like weight shifting on an old board. Then nothing. I slid out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the table. I switched it on, walked to the door, and opened it slowly. The beam lit up the porch, the trees, the empty clearing. Nothing. I stepped outside in my socks and stood still. It was cold, but I didn't care. I just stared out into the dark woods. I listened. All I heard was the wind. Maybe it was a deer, or just the cabin settling. Old buildings make noise, especially in the cold. I went back inside, locked the door, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I noticed something odd near the fire pit. The ground was covered in dry leaves, but right in front of the pit, there was a patch that looked brushed away, like someone had kicked or swept them aside. I looked closer and saw a footprint, just one. It was faint, but it was there. A boot print, maybe size 10 or 11. Not mine. I wear a 13. I looked around but didn't see any others. The ground was dry, so it was hard to track anything. Still, it bugged me. I kept telling myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe a hunter passed through. Maybe the footprint was old, and the wind had just uncovered it. But I didn't really believe that. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I made a fire in the pit, cooked some sausages, and chopped more wood for the stove. Every so often, I looked into the trees. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. That night, I made sure the rifle was loaded and set it next to the cot. I left the generator off before bed to save fuel, so it was dark. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind was calmer, and that somehow made every little sound louder. I heard branches snap far off, then closer, then silence. I didn't sleep much. By the 4th day, I was jumpy. I kept thinking about that footprint. It didn't make sense that only one was there. Even if someone had walked through and only brushed away the leaves in one spot, I should have seen more signs. I started noticing little things. The cabin door seemed like it had been moved. I was sure I locked it before going out for water, but when I came back, it felt wrong. Not open, just not the way I left it. One of my coolers was slightly ajar, even though I knew I'd closed it tight the night before. A package of jerky was missing. Maybe I misplaced it. Maybe I forgot. But I don't forget food. I'm the kind of person who keeps a mental inventory of snacks. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark, holding the rifle, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time further from the porch, out by the trees, moving slow, not animals. They were too spaced out, too careful. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it through the window. Nothing. I turned off the light and kept waiting. Then, maybe an hour later, I heard the footsteps again, this time behind the cabin, then near the generator. Then they stopped. I didn't hear them walk away. They just stopped. I stayed frozen in that chair until dawn. When the sun came up, I checked the area behind the cabin. Nothing obvious, but I knew what I heard. I wanted to leave, but part of me kept thinking I was overreacting. I hadn't seen anyone. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe I just wasn't used to being alone in the woods. That was the trap. I kept explaining it away, even as my gut kept screaming something wasn't right. On the 5th day, I decided to walk back toward where the dirt road met the main road, just to make sure I remembered the way out. I figured if something happened, I wanted to know I could leave fast. I didn't bring much, just my backpack, a bottle of water, and the rifle. I left the generator running so I'd hear it when I got close again. It was quiet in the woods, and the sky was overcast. I walked about a mile when I noticed something strange. There was a plastic bottle on the ground near a tree. It was dirty, but not old. A Gatorade bottle. I hadn't brought Gatorade. I kept walking and found more trash. An old beef jerky wrapper, a crumpled snack cake box. None of it was mine. Someone had been camping out here. Recently, I scanned the trees and kept moving. About another half-mile up the trail, I saw it. Tarp, faded blue, strung between two trees with bungee cords. It was half hidden by branches, but it was definitely a makeshift camp. I stopped and crouched low. No movement, no sound. The camp looked empty. There was a folding chair, a pile of firewood, and a stack of empty food cans. A small black backpack hung from a tree branch. I waited a full 10 minutes before I stepped closer. No one was there, but someone had been living there. For how long, I didn't know. The fire pit was cold, but not old. No mold on the food trash, and the tarp was dry under the fallen leaves. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away and walked back to the cabin. Fast. When I got there, the generator was off. I know I left it running. The fuel line was cut. Clean. Not chewed, not snapped. Cut with a blade. I stood there, staring at it. Then I heard something in the trees. A cough. Not loud, but human. I went inside, locked the door, and waited with the rifle in my lap. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every noise outside felt closer. I stopped cooking because I didn't want the smell drawing anyone in. I rationed the dry food, granola bars, crackers, dried fruit. On the 7th day, I made the decision to leave. I packed my truck before sunrise. I moved fast, double-checking everything. I kept the rifle loaded and within arm's reach the whole time. I took one last look at the cabin, then started the engine and began the slow drive down the dirt road. I made it about a mile before I saw the rope. It was stretched across the road between two trees, tied at about hood level, just high enough to snap the windshield or injure someone. I slammed on the brakes. I got out and walked to the rope with the rifle. The rope was thick like a towing strap and it was anchored tight. It would have done serious damage if I'd hit it at any speed. I was 37 when I decided to take a solo trip up to a remote cabin I used to visit as a teenager with my uncle. It was deep in the northern woods, about 20 miles off the main road, down a winding dirt path called Cutter's Pass. My uncle used to say it was named after a logging foreman who vanished out there back in the 1950s. That always sounded like some kind of campfire story, and I never really thought much about it. The truth is, I always liked the place. It was quiet, away from everything. A good spot to think, write, breathe. I hadn't been there in over 15 years. Life had gotten in the way, work, relationships, kids, all the usual. But now my kids were older and I had just gone through a divorce. I needed the space, so I packed my old Ford Explorer with supplies, food for a week, camping gear, a shotgun, a first aid kit, and a few old paperbacks. I didn't want any distractions, so I left my laptop behind and told my kids not to expect any texts. There was no signal up there anyway. The drive up was uneventful. I hit the dirt road by noon and reached the cabin by mid-afternoon. It was still there, standing like a weathered old man in the woods. A bit crooked, roof sagging slightly, and moss growing thick on the north side. But the door still opened. The old ironwood stove was still in the corner. There was no electricity, never had been. Just a hand pump for water, a propane stove, and a compost toilet out back in a shack with a broken door. It was exactly how I remembered it. I unloaded the truck and set everything up before dark. I gathered wood from the old pile out back and lit a fire in the stove. The air inside the cabin always had a damp smell to it, like old bark and dust. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cot, cracked open a can of chili, and sat on the front step with my dinner and a flashlight. The only sounds were the wind through the pines and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. That first night was peaceful. I slept deep, warm inside the cabin with the stove keeping the place just above chilly. The second day, I spent hiking through the nearby woods. I followed the old logging trail that wrapped around a narrow creek, remembering spots where my uncle used to point out deer tracks or mushrooms we could eat. I brought a small pack with water and snacks and was back at the cabin by mid-afternoon. It wasn't until the third night that things started to feel off. I was sitting outside again, eating beans and sausage from a pan, when I heard something in the woods. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals or wind. It was slower, heavier, almost like a person walking, but with long gaps between the steps, like they were trying not to be heard. I held still and turned off my flashlight. I waited for a while, but I didn't hear it again. Eventually, I went inside and locked the door, which was just a wooden bar across the frame. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 feet from the cabin, near the woodpile, I saw a single boot print. Not mine. It was fresher than mine, deeper from recent pressure. It was facing toward the cabin. I hadn't seen or heard another vehicle on the road, and I knew there were no other cabins nearby. Maybe a hunter, I told myself. Someone passing through. Still, it stuck with me. I tried to ignore it, spent the day chopping more wood and organizing supplies. That night, I set a tripwire with a tin can around the back of the cabin. It wasn't much, but it would make noise if someone walked past. I loaded my shotgun, more out of nerves than anything else. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the can rattle. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned low. I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun and crept to the back window. Nothing. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the outline of trees. I waited a long time before going back to sleep. The next day, I found the can on the ground, rolled about 3 feet from where I had placed it. The tripwire was still attached to the tree, but it looked like someone had stepped over it and nudged the can just enough to make noise. It wasn't the wind. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and found another footprint. This one was closer to the outhouse. Again, not mine. I began to feel like someone was watching me. I kept looking up at the trees, half expecting to see someone standing between the trunks. But there was never anything. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going and sat inside with the shotgun across my lap. Every sound felt louder than it was. I started to doubt myself, thinking maybe I had imagined the prints, or maybe they were older and I hadn't noticed. Maybe an animal knocked over the can. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to hike back out to my truck, about half a mile up the trail, where I had left it parked on a slight rise. I thought about packing everything up and leaving, but when I got there, I found something that made the decision for me. Both rear tires were slashed. Not popped, slashed with long cuts through the rubber. I checked under the truck for any sign of tampering with the fuel line or engine, but everything else seemed untouched. I stood there for a long time, shotgun slung over my shoulder, looking around at the silent woods. Whoever had done it wasn't trying to steal anything. They just didn't want me to leave. I walked back to the cabin, thinking fast. I had no cell service. No one knew the exact location of the cabin, just a general area. I had told my oldest son I'd be gone for a week. It was only day 4. That meant 3 more days before anyone might come looking for me, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. I locked the cabin tight, even boarded up the window with a spare plank. I filled a few pots with water in case the pump stopped working. I rationed my food. I cleaned and loaded the shotgun again and laid the shells on the table beside me. I wasn't going to sleep anymore. Not really. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, they came all the way up to the porch. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath and sat in the dark, shotgun aimed at the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I sat like that for an hour until the sky started to turn a faint blue. When I finally opened the door with the sun rising behind me, there was nothing. But the muddy imprint of a boot on the porch step was fresh. I spent the 5th day fortifying the cabin. I blocked the back window completely, nailed a second board across the front door, and moved everything heavy I could in front of it. I also started leaving notes, one in the stove, one under my cot, and one inside a sealed coffee tin, describing what had happened so far, just in case. On the 6th day, I heard a vehicle in the distance. I thought it was real at first, the low rumble of an engine echoing off the trees. I ran outside, shouting, waving a bright red bandana. Nothing. No sound. No vehicle. I realized then how bad isolation messes with your head. I wasn't even sure what was real anymore. That night, they came again. This time, they tried the door. Quiet at first, then louder. Someone tested the handle, then pushed against it, making the whole frame creak. I raised the shotgun and stood just behind the table. The pressure stopped. Silence. Then footsteps circling the cabin, crunching leaves and twigs underfoot. I fired a single shot through the front wall. The footsteps stopped. I listened for return fire or a shout, but there was nothing. I waited until sunrise. When I opened the door, I found another boot print near the corner of the cabin, and this time a small piece of paper wedged under a rock. It was blank. No words, just folded and placed there. That scared me more than anything else. The 7th morning, I knew I couldn't wait for rescue. If someone came, they might not even find me in time. I packed what I could into a single bag: water, a protein bar, ammo. I left everything else. I took the shotgun and left the cabin just after sunrise, hiking east instead of west, avoiding the road. My plan was to make it to an old ranger station I remembered from when I was a kid. It was about 6 miles through dense forest, but I hoped it was still there. I moved fast and quiet. Every sound made me freeze. I didn't follow any trail. I went straight through brush, across a stream, over a rocky hill. Around noon, I stopped to drink and rest. That's when I saw movement behind me, just for a second. A dark shape between trees, too far to shoot. I moved again. It took most of the day, but by late afternoon I saw the outline of the ranger station. It was old, roof caved in, but the radio antenna was still standing. I climbed the hill and made my way inside. It was empty, covered in moss and rot, but the emergency radio was still bolted to the wall. I didn't expect it to work, but it did. I cranked the power handle and keyed the mic, sending out a distress call. Nothing at first, then static, then a voice. It was faint, but it was real. I gave my name, location, and explained the situation. The voice said help was coming. Stay put. Lock the doors. I did. Took 5 hours. I waited with the shotgun in my lap, watching the woods. Just before dark, I saw flashing lights between the trees. Rangers and sheriff deputies. I had been looking forward to a solo trip for a long time. Life had been stressful for months. Between work, family responsibilities, and just the noise of everyday life, I felt like I needed to get away from everything. I wasn't running from anyone or anything dramatic. I just needed silence. Real silence. The kind you can only find in the middle of nowhere. I found a cabin listed on a small rental site I hadn't heard of before. It was called Cabin 16. No fancy name, just a number. The pictures showed a plain wooden structure in the middle of the woods. It was located off a narrow road somewhere in northern Michigan. The owner mentioned in the description that it didn't have Wi-Fi and cell signal could be unreliable. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to unplug. The cabin had no neighbors, and the nearest town was a 30-minute drive away. I booked 5 nights. I planned to hike, cook simple meals, read, and sleep. I packed a bunch of books, brought my portable stove, canned food, extra water, first aid supplies, and a couple of knives just in case. I knew how to take care of myself in the woods. I had gone on long hikes before and even done a few solo camping trips. But this would be my first time in a full cabin alone. I left early in the morning and drove for hours. Once I got off the main roads, I was surrounded by dense trees. The road narrowed to gravel, then to dirt. There weren't many signs, and I had to backtrack a couple of times. But eventually, I found the little wooden sign that said, Cabin 16, nailed to a tree, with a red arrow pointing left down a narrow trail. My tires crunched over dead leaves as I drove down the path. The trees leaned in close on both sides, and I slowed down. The cabin sat in a small clearing. It wasn't big, just one floor with a porch and a steep roof. There was an old fire pit out front and a shed behind it. The trees surrounding the cabin were thick and tall. It felt quiet, heavy quiet. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The air was cold and dry. No wind, no birds, just quiet. That was the first moment I felt something strange. Not fear, not exactly. Just a weird weight in the air. I shook it off. I reminded myself I was here to be alone, and this is what alone felt like. Inside, the cabin was clean but basic. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small table, one chair, and a cot against the far wall with an old mattress. There was a bathroom, too, no hot water, but it worked. No electricity, just a battery-powered lantern and a box of candles. I unpacked slowly, placing everything in neat little piles. I set up the lantern on the table, stored my food, laid out my sleeping bag on the cot. I checked the windows, one in the front, one in the back, and a small one in the bathroom. I tested the door to make sure it locked. It did, but the lock felt old. That first night was quiet. I cooked some canned soup on my portable stove, read a few chapters from a book, and turned in early. I woke up once around 3 a.m. to complete silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals. Just that weird, heavy stillness. I went to the window and looked out. Nothing but black trees. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and forced myself to sleep. The second day, I went hiking. I followed a path behind the cabin that curved into the woods. The air was fresh, and I didn't see any trash or signs of other people. Just woods. I walked for a few hours, stopping now and then to sit on a log and listen. That silence again. It didn't feel peaceful. Felt thick, like the trees were watching. I know how that sounds, but that's what it felt like. When I got back, I noticed something that made me pause. The door to the shed was cracked open. I hadn't touched it. I didn't even plan to go near it. It was about 20 feet from the back of the cabin. It looked old and weather-beaten with rusty hinges. I walked over slowly and pushed the door fully open. Inside were old tools, a few cans of paint, a rotted lawn chair, and something that looked like a broken generator. Nothing that stood out, but I didn't like how dark it was inside. I left the door as it was and went back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door and put one of my knives beside the bed. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten curious. I tried to believe that. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. I kept hearing sounds. Not loud ones, just tiny shifts in the silence. A crunch outside, like someone stepping on dry leaves. Then nothing. A while later, a small creak from the porch. I held my breath and listened for a long time. No wind, no rain. Just silence broken by tiny noises. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. At one point, I got up and turned on the lantern. I stood by the window and looked out. There was nothing. The fire pit, the trees, the dirt path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there and slipped back into the woods. The third day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I didn't feel like hiking anymore. I spent some time whittling a stick just to keep my hands busy. I tried to read, but I kept glancing at the woods. Around noon, I walked around the cabin, just checking the area. That's when I found the footprints. They weren't mine. I know what mine looked like, heavy boots with a specific tread. These were flatter, smoother, like from thinner shoes. I followed them around the side of the cabin and saw that they went up to the porch. Then they stopped. They didn't go back. That messed with me. I looked for other signs, but there was nothing. No dropped items, no markings, just the prints. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had been out here. A hunter, maybe. But why come up to the cabin and not knock? Why not leave a note? That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up. I had both of my knives nearby. The lantern was turned on low and I kept it beside the bed. I felt exposed even with the door locked. At one point, I heard something brush against the wall outside. It was a soft dragging noise, like someone running their hand along the wood. Then it stopped. I wanted to leave, but it was pitch black out and I didn't want to try to drive that narrow trail at night. I told myself I'd go in the morning. The fourth day, I started packing right after breakfast. I loaded up my gear, checked the tires, and was about to grab the last bag when I noticed the shed door again. It was wide open. It hadn't been like that the day before. I walked slowly over, heart thudding in my chest. Inside, something was different. The chair was gone. I looked around, trying to see if it had fallen or been moved. Then I spotted it, about 10 feet into the woods, behind the shed. The chair had been placed there, facing the cabin, just sitting there in the dirt. I didn't go near it. I turned and walked back to the truck. As I reached for the driver's door, I felt something off. I looked down. My rear tire on the left side was flat, not just low, slashed. A deep, clean cut across the rubber. Not something that happened on accident. My stomach dropped. I went to the back and checked the spare. Still there. I grabbed it and the tools and changed the tire as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time. The trees were too still. I couldn't shake the feeling someone was watching me from behind them. I drove out of there carefully but fast. The branches scraped my truck as I pushed it down the narrow path. When I hit the gravel road again, I didn't stop. I drove all the way to the nearest town and pulled into a gas station. I sat there for a long time just breathing. I didn't call the cops. I didn't know what to say. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone. No proof, just a feeling. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't leave a review. I didn't tell anyone for a while. It took time for me to stop checking over my shoulder every time I was in a quiet place. But I know what happened. I know someone was out there. Someone who knew how to move without being seen. Someone who wanted me to feel afraid, but not enough to run. Not at first. They wanted me to stay, just long enough. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed that last night. If I hadn't seen the chair. If I hadn't checked the tire before dark. I don't let myself think too much about that part. But I haven't been back to the woods since. I won't. That quiet I wanted so bad? I don't want it anymore. Some silences aren't peaceful. Some silences are just the space between the noise and something worse. I was just looking to get away from it all. Work had been brutal for months. I'm in logistics, nothing fancy. But the company had been bleeding money from delays and overtime. I was working 12, sometimes 14-hour days. I wasn't sleeping much. My back was starting to go out from sitting at the desk all day. I knew I needed a break. Not a party, not a road trip. Just some peace and quiet somewhere far away from the office, traffic, and my phone. A guy I used to work with had once mentioned this old hunting cabin in the mountains near Little Bear Ridge. He and some friends used to go up there years ago, but he said nobody had used it in a while. It belonged to his cousin's family, and when I reached out, they were more than happy to let me use it. It was a solid 2-hour drive from the nearest town, deep into the kind of woods you only see in pictures. I figured it was perfect. No neighbors, no noise, just trees, a stream, and the sound of wind. I drove up Friday morning. I had packed simple. A few days worth of food, bottled water, some canned stuff, a small propane stove, sleeping bag, flashlight, tools, and a first aid kit. I didn't bring my laptop. I turned off my phone before I even left the house. I wanted this to feel like I had disappeared from the world. For the first hour or so, I drove through open country, rolling hills, fences, cows. The last hour was narrow mountain roads, twisting and turning. The kind where you have to slow to 15 miles an hour just to avoid flying off the edge. By the time I got to the old turnoff, it was mid-afternoon. There was no sign or marker, just a dirt path barely wide enough for my SUV, cutting through thick trees. I followed it for another mile or so. The path was overgrown, the branches scraping against the sides of my car. At one point, I had to stop and move a fallen branch that was too thick to drive over. The cabin finally appeared in a clearing. It was smaller than I expected. The roof was intact but covered in moss. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle. The walls were weathered gray and brown, with a few patches of old paint still hanging on. There was no electricity, no running water, but it had a wood stove and an old metal sink. A single bed frame with a flat mattress sat in the corner. Dust hung in the air like powder, and it smelled like old wood and dry leaves. It was exactly what I wanted. I set my gear down and opened the windows to air it out. The breeze that came in was cold and clean. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. I started a small fire in the wood stove and made a simple meal: canned beans, a slice of bread, and a bottle of water. I sat outside afterward, watching the sun drop behind the trees. It got cold fast. No sounds except birds and wind. That night, I slept hard. Deep, dreamless sleep. The kind you only get when your body finally lets go. The next morning, I woke early. The air had that crisp bite to it, and the cabin was cold enough to see my breath. I made instant coffee with water I'd boiled on the propane stove. I sat on the porch wrapped in a thick jacket, watching fog settle low across the trees. I decided to explore a bit, maybe hike along the stream I'd seen on the drive-in. I grabbed a small backpack, loaded it with water, a snack, a knife, and a basic compass. I wasn't planning to go far. The woods were thicker than I realized. After about 20 minutes, I lost sight of the cabin. I kept going, following the sound of running water. Eventually, I found the stream, clear, shallow, fast-moving. It was peaceful. I sat down on a rock beside it and ate a granola bar. Everything was still. Too still, maybe. It was the kind of quiet where even your own breathing sounds too loud. After a while, I headed back. Or at least I thought I did. I don't know exactly when I noticed something was wrong. I walked for at least 15 minutes, expecting to see the cabin or the path or at least the clearing. But nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same. I didn't remember crossing that many fallen logs or climbing over rocks. I pulled out the compass and tried to retrace my direction, but I must have gone in circles. I stopped, took a deep breath, and forced myself not to panic. I knew better. I've been hiking before. First rule: don't keep walking blindly. So I marked a tree with my knife and sat down to rest. I gave it 20 minutes. Still nothing. That's when I realized how quickly things could go bad. It was already afternoon. The sun would start dropping soon. I had no cell signal, no GPS, no map. I had a knife and 2 bottles of water. I stood up, tried to stay calm, and picked a direction that sloped downward, figuring it might lead to a road or maybe back toward the stream. I walked slowly, stopping every 100 feet to mark another tree. After an hour, I saw something through the trees. A roof. Relief hit so hard I almost laughed. It wasn't the cabin. It was another structure. An old shack, maybe. The roof was rusted metal and the walls were rotting. I approached carefully. The door was missing, just a dark opening. Inside, it was empty except for a few broken boards and what looked like a rusted stove. No furniture, no signs of recent use, but I could see a path near it. Just a narrow line where the ground had been worn by feet or maybe animals. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. It did. It led back to my cabin. I recognized the porch, the tire tracks, even the branch I'd moved off the path the day before. That night, I stayed inside. I lit a fire in the stove and double-checked my supplies. I felt stupid. I hadn't even gone that far and still almost got turned around bad enough to have to spend the night out there. I reminded myself that I was fine now, back in one piece, but something had changed. Couldn't relax. The next day, I stayed close. I gathered more firewood, checked around the cabin, cleaned up some of the junk inside. But I kept thinking about that shack. It wasn't on the map my friend's cousin had sent. It looked abandoned. But why would someone build a second place so close to this one, in the middle of nowhere? Later that afternoon, I heard something, a branch cracking, then another, footsteps, not fast but steady. I stood up on the porch, listening. They stopped. I waited 5 minutes, maybe more. Nothing. I figured maybe it was a deer or even just wind knocking down branches. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up to little noises, creaking, snapping, the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. At one point, I swore I heard something outside, like breathing, heavy, slow breathing, just past the wall near my head. I held still for what felt like an hour, listening. Eventually, it stopped. I never heard footsteps, just the breathing, then nothing. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt. Not boots, bare feet, big ones. They went from the tree line to the side of the cabin, then around the back. Then they disappeared. I walked the whole clearing twice, looking for more. The ground was dry enough that the prints were shallow, but they were there. Long toes, wide heels, too wide for a normal man. I kept telling myself maybe they were old, maybe they were animal tracks distorted by the weather. But I knew what I saw. I decided I would leave the next day. I had enough gas to get back to town, enough food to last the night. I wasn't gonna mess around trying to play survivalist with something strange hanging around. That night, I locked the door from the inside and slid a heavy beam across it. I kept my knife beside me and didn't light a fire. I wanted to be able to hear clearly. I stayed awake longer than usual, just listening. The wind picked up sometime around midnight. Then I heard it again, breathing, this time closer, not outside, inside, the kind of sound you hear when someone exhales through their nose. I held still. My eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes. Nothing moved, but I felt it. That same feeling you get when someone is behind you. That cold, tight pressure in your neck and back. Then a thump, something light, like a step on the old wooden floor. I sat up, knife in hand, back against the wall. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear something. Slow movement. I waited. Another soft step. Then another. And then it stopped. I didn't sleep. I stayed frozen like that until the light started creeping in through the window cracks. When morning came, I opened the door and left everything behind except my keys and a bottle of water. I jogged to the car, unlocked it, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the paved road 2 hours later. When I got home, I called the cousin, told him thanks, but I wouldn't be going back. I didn't say why. I never found out who or what was out there. All I know is I wasn't alone, and I was lucky to leave. I booked the cabin to get away from everything. That was the main reason. I wasn't running from something big like heartbreak or trauma. I just needed quiet. I'd been working back-to-back shifts at the hospital for months. Sometimes I'd go 5 or 6 days without sleeping more than a few hours. My hands shook at work. I dropped things. I started forgetting stuff. That scared me more than anything. When your job involves needles and blood, and people trust you with their lives, you can't afford to forget things. So I took 2 weeks off. No laptop, no work emails, just quiet. I found this cabin listed on an old travel forum. It was private 6 miles from the nearest paved road, sitting at the base of a hill in the Appalachian foothills. The photos showed a long gravel driveway, thick woods, a small wooden porch, and a steep slope behind the cabin thick with trees. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors. That was the draw. I left early in the morning, drove 7 hours, and finally turned off onto the gravel road that wound up through thick trees. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and parts of it had deep ruts filled with water. I didn't like that. I was driving my Subaru, which could handle some rough terrain, but I hadn't expected it to be this bad. Still, I kept going. The road got worse as I climbed higher. Branches scraped the sides of the car. I passed two small, rusted-out trailers buried in the woods, both abandoned. At least, I hoped they were abandoned. They gave me a weird feeling, and I kept driving. When I reached the cabin, it looked almost exactly like the photos. Small, two-story, with an old wooden porch and faded green paint. There was a shed off to the left, half collapsed, and a rusty old wheelbarrow leaned against the porch railing. The air smelled clean, earthy. A few birds called out. Otherwise, it was silent. I got out and stretched. My back popped. I walked around the cabin once, just looking it over. The woods were thick in every direction. Not a single sign of a house, car, or person. That's what I wanted. Felt like the air was thicker here, heavier. Pressed in from all sides, but not in a bad way. More like it was hugging the space around the cabin. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The inside was small, plain, and smelled like cedar and dust. There was a stone fireplace on the far wall, a couch, and a tiny kitchen with an old gas stove. The bedroom was upstairs in a loft, with one bed and one small window that looked out over the driveway. I unpacked, made some tea, and sat on the porch with a book. That was the first time I saw him. It wasn't anything strange at first, just a figure standing in the woods maybe 100 feet down the hill. It was hard to tell in the low light. He didn't move, just stood between two trees. I stared for a while, but when I blinked, he was gone. I figured it was nothing. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the long drive had me out of it. That night, I slept hard. No dreams, no tossing. I woke up late the next morning and felt better than I had in months. I made coffee, walked the property a little, and spent most of the day reading and just sitting outside. The quiet was perfect. Later that afternoon, I walked out back toward the woods. The hill behind the cabin was steep but manageable, and I was curious to see what was up there. I hiked up slowly, listening to the wind in the trees. There were no trails, no signs of people. I reached a ridge after about 20 minutes and looked down on the cabin below. It looked smaller from up there, almost like a toy. The woods stretched out in all directions. Then I saw it again. A figure, this time at the bottom of the hill, standing near the edge of the trees behind the cabin. Same thing, still motionless. I stared and didn't blink. He didn't move. I watched him for a full minute before turning back down the hill. I told myself it was probably just some hiker or hunter, though it didn't make sense that he'd be so still, or that he didn't call out or wave. Still, I kept telling myself it was nothing. The next few days were fine, peaceful mostly, but that feeling never left me, the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I'd hear a snap of a branch or the crunch of leaves just a little too close, but when I looked, nothing was there. At night, I made fires in the fireplace and read by lantern light. I never turned on the old radio in the cabin. It didn't feel right. On the 5th day, I found footprints. I'd walked out to the shed to look for firewood. There was a stack inside, dry and surprisingly clean, so I filled my arms and walked back. That's when I noticed them. Prints in the mud that weren't mine. They led from the trees to the back of the cabin, then around the side toward the front porch. Deep, clear boot prints, bigger than my feet. My stomach dropped. I looked around. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. No one. I checked inside. Nothing had been touched, at least not that I could tell. Still, I locked the doors, something I hadn't been doing before. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old cabin floor made me sit up and listen. At one point, I thought I heard something outside the window, just breathing. I told myself it was the wind. The next morning, I made a plan. I was going to hike down to where the gravel road started and see if I could get enough signal to call someone. Anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I just needed to talk to another human. I packed a backpack with snacks, water, and my phone. I left early and hiked down the long, twisting road. It took nearly 2 hours to get to the bottom. No signal. I stood there for a while, trying to decide what to do next. I could leave, just start walking until I reached a town. But something about that felt wrong. My car was at the cabin. My gear. I wasn't ready to abandon it all just yet. So I started back. That's when I saw the print again. Halfway back up the road, on a stretch of mud where my own footprints had hardened in the sun. There was a single fresh boot print, deep, facing downhill. Whoever it was, they'd passed me, probably while I was at the bottom, probably heading toward the cabin. I ran the rest of the way back. When I got there, the door was closed, locked like I'd left it. Nothing inside looked touched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the fireplace poker in my hand and waited. Hours passed. The fire died. The cabin got cold. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. Soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful. They stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. The doorknob turned once. Then silence. No knock, just waiting. I sat there, holding my breath, until the first light of morning started showing through the window. When I finally opened the door, no one was there. But on the porch, right at the door, was a fresh boot print in the dust, facing the door. That day, I decided to leave. I packed fast, throwing everything into the car. I didn't care about neatness. I just wanted out. But the car wouldn't start. Dead. Nothing. No click, no lights. I checked the battery, it looked fine. I checked the gas gauge, half full. No reason it shouldn't start. I tried again and again. Nothing. So I locked myself back inside and waited for morning. I figured I'd hike out with the emergency GPS beacon I'd brought. I'd hit the SOS and someone would come. That was the plan. That night, it got worse. Just after midnight, I heard the shed door creak open. I knew the sound by now. It was heavy, dragging wood. Then silence. 10 minutes later, footsteps on the gravel. They stopped outside the window. I didn't move. I was upstairs in the loft, tucked low near the bed. The window was across the room. I stayed there for hours. Then, a sound I'll never forget. Something being dragged across the porch. Heavy. A scraping, shuffling sound. Back and forth. Over and over. I didn't look. I just listened. At sunrise, I opened the door. The firewood was gone from the shed. Every piece. It had all been stacked neatly in a perfect square in front of the door, blocking it like a wall. It would have taken me 10 minutes to move it all. I didn't touch it. I climbed out a back window and ran. I hiked until I reached the main road and activated the GPS beacon. I sat down and waited. 6 hours later, a rescue truck found me. They said I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I hadn't. I told them I was fine, just needed a tow and some rest. I didn't tell them about the man. Later, when I got home, I had my car checked. The mechanic said the starter had been cut, clean like with a knife. I filed a police report, but nothing ever came of it. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing, just my word. I never went back to that cabin. Never tried to get my deposit back. I didn't care. I didn't tell my friends the full story, only that it was creepy and remote. But sometimes when I'm walking alone, especially in the woods, I catch that feeling again. That slow, quiet awareness that someone is just out of sight. Watching, not moving, just waiting. I never used to be scared of being alone in the woods. I grew up hiking with my dad, spending weekends camping near lakes, and sometimes even staying in remote cabins when we could find one cheap. The quiet never bothered me. It actually helped me think. After years of working in a busy city, constantly surrounded by noise, screens, and people rushing past, I started missing that silence. So when I finally saved up enough for a little break, I rented out a small off-grid cabin deep in the mountains of North Carolina. I'd found it through a listing on a forum for people who like to hike and backpack. The guy who owned it said he built it himself when he was younger. It wasn't fancy. One room with stove, outhouse 20 feet away, and a gravity-fed water system from a nearby creek. No electricity, no cell signal. That was what I wanted. It sat near the edge of a ravine, just off an old fire road that hadn't been used in years. The guy gave me directions, and I printed them out before I left because GPS wasn't going to help once I passed the last town. The drive there took almost 8 hours. The last 2 were on narrow roads that twisted through the forest like they were drawn by hand. I didn't pass another car the whole way in. By the time I parked my truck at the end of the old fire road and loaded my gear into a backpack, it was already late afternoon. The hike in was about 2 miles, and I could see why nobody really used the road anymore. It had started to wash out in places, and parts of it were blocked with downed trees and thick brush. I followed the path as best as I could, keeping the notes in my back pocket and checking them every now and then. When I reached the cabin, I was already sweating. The place looked even more isolated than I expected. It sat on a small patch of flat ground, maybe 50 feet from the edge of a steep drop into the ravine. The trees were thick on all sides, and the only clearing was the patch directly around the cabin. The roof was metal, and the walls were weathered but solid. A little porch stretched out the front, with an old rocking chair and a wooden crate for firewood. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had mailed me and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood and dust. Everything inside was basic. A cot against one wall, a small table and chair near the window, shelves with some canned food, and a wood stove in the corner. The kind of place where silence sinks into your bones. I unpacked, lit a lantern, and got a small fire going. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the trees sway in the wind while the sun went down behind the mountains. The next morning, I woke up early. My plan was simple: read, write in my notebook, maybe hike around the area. I had enough food to last me a week, plus a water filter, a hatchet, and a camp stove. I liked the simplicity. For the first couple of days, everything was calm. I settled into a rhythm. I'd wake up, make coffee on the porch, then walk down the narrow trail that followed the edge of the ravine. The air was cold in the mornings, and the forest stayed quiet, except for birds and the wind in the branches. At night, I'd sit by the fire and write. It was on the third day that I saw something strange. I was walking farther than usual, deeper along the ravine trail. There were no markings or signs, but the path was visible enough. At one point, I noticed something shiny about 20 feet off the trail. I stepped off the path and pushed through the underbrush until I reached it. It was an old piece of metal, maybe part of a camping stove or a lantern. Nearby, I saw more junk. An empty canteen. A torn tarp. Everything was old, weathered from rain and sun, but it looked like someone had tried to set up camp here at some point. The strange thing was, the stuff looked like it had been just left, not packed up or cleaned up, like the person left in a hurry. I didn't think too much about it. People abandon campsites all the time. Maybe they had trouble hiking out. Maybe they just didn't care. Still, something about it bugged me. The way the tarp was tangled in the branches, like it had been yanked. I didn't see any animal tracks or signs of a bear, but the forest floor was thick with dead leaves. I went back to the cabin and didn't say anything about it in my notes. I just wrote, "Old abandoned campsite strange, maybe from years ago." The next night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something outside. Not animals, just movement, twigs breaking. At one point, I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I listened for a while, but it stopped. Just silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon digging around the outhouse. I didn't know it yet, but I should have left that morning. Instead, I stayed. On the 5th day, I decided to hike down into the ravine itself. The slope was steep, and there wasn't a clear trail, but I thought it would be a good challenge. I strapped on my boots, packed some food, and made my way down through the trees. The further I went, the colder it got. The sunlight didn't reach the bottom as much, and the air was damp. I started seeing moss on the trees and big boulders scattered around. After about half an hour, I reached a dry creek bed and sat on a rock to drink some water. That was when I noticed something in the mud near my feet, boot prints. Not mine. These were older but still clear. They were leading deeper into the ravine, in the direction of a narrow rocky gap between two cliffs. I followed them for maybe 10 minutes before I saw it. Another campsite, but this one was worse. It looked like someone had built a shelter from branches and bark, then abandoned it. Torn clothes were tangled in the sticks. A backpack ripped open, spilled out old gear, water filter, rope, even a compass. But no person, no bones or anything like that. It looked like someone had lived here for a while. And then, something happened. I felt the hair on the back of my neck go up. I don't know why. It was just a feeling. like I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned around and climbed out of the ravine fast, heart pounding the whole way. Back at the cabin, I locked the door even though there was nobody around for miles. That night it rained hard. Thunder echoed through the trees, and wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Couldn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I thought I heard a sound on the porch, like wood creaking. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and stood near the window. I couldn't see anything through the rain, but I waited a long time before going back to bed. In the morning, I stepped out and saw something that made my stomach turn. Footprints on the porch, bare feet, not boots. They were wet, wide, and led up to the door and then away. Just two prints in and out, like someone had come to the door during the night and stood there. I felt sick. I packed everything I could in 10 minutes. I left behind my extra food, left the water filter, left the book I was reading. I just grabbed my bag and started down the trail toward where I left the truck. But when I got to the road, the first thing I noticed was that the rear window of my truck had been shattered. Glass was everywhere. Inside the bed of the truck, my spare gear had been thrown around. Someone had gone through it. I didn't stop. I got in, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I was 2 hours from the nearest town. I didn't even think about calling the guy who rented me the cabin. I didn't report it to the ranger station. I just wanted to forget it. For months afterward, I kept trying to make sense of it. I kept telling myself it could have been a squatter or someone living off-grid. Maybe they thought I was a threat, or maybe they were just watching to make sure I didn't find something I wasn't supposed to. But those barefoot prints on the porch, those haunted me. A few weeks later, I did some digging online. I didn't find anything about missing people in that specific area. But on another forum, I found a thread where someone talked about seeing strange signs deep in that same mountain range. Campsites, old gear, signs of someone living out there. One person claimed he ran into a man wearing layers of filthy clothes, who stared at him without saying a word, then walked back into the woods. I stopped reading after that. It's been over a year now, and I haven't been back to the mountains. I still love the woods. I still go hiking, but never alone, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. The cabin still shows up in forum posts now and then, passed around by word of mouth. People saying it's peaceful, cheap, remote. Some even say they've been there and had a great time, but I never tell them what I saw. I never mention the shelter in the ravine, or the footprints on the porch, or the man who may or may not be watching those woods for anyone who gets too close to something they're not supposed to find. All I know is I got out, and whatever or whoever was out there, I hope I never see them again.